No, this is taken. This one's open. Okay. Yes, you will.
Did you give him the cigar?
Okay, everybody, good morning. My name is Louis Polito, library assistant here at the Belmar Public Library. On behalf of the rest of my staff and our library director, David Holman, over here, I'd like to welcome you all to this great, fascinating living history presentation featuring Kenneth Serfass in character as General Ulysses S. Grant. The library is excited to have a program like this here. You're going to see the libraries changing over the years, where we're morphing more, not just into just books and stuff, but we're now providing experiences through programming, activities, events, as well as also places for people to get things done. With our technology and our other options, digital, online, we encourage you to take advantage of that, and we welcome everybody to use them. If you're going to go out there and use services, don't use your credit card, use your library card instead. Right now, I want to point out a couple things. The library has a daily regimen of activities and health and wellness activities for adults and seniors. Mondays and Fridays we have meditation, we have healthy steps, we have mobility, we have Tai Chi, and we have chair yoga. We also have a series of cultural programs we run throughout the year. We've done already Chinese New Year and the Irish Soda Bread Contest, and we just did Cinco de Mayo, and we're going to have Diwali as the next celebration in November. So we're looking forward to have that. We're going to have everyone join us there. We also have a nice series of children's programming from top of story time to activities where we have live animal events for the kids. We have wolves, penguins, and reptiles for the kids later this year. Okay, so we have a great series of programs and activities for people to enjoy and come away with something more than just a little book here or there. So we're more than just books. So with that, I'm going to bring on our special guest tonight. I remind you that our guest, as we go back in time to the 1860s, okay, when we travel back, let us remember that at this point in time, our guest is General Ulysses S. Grant. He has not yet been president, as we know he will be, so he can't speak to those issues. It hasn't happened for him yet. So bear that in mind. So with that, the library is proud to present United States Army General Ulysses S. Grant.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you for taking time out from your day. I know Saturday is a lighter day because all you have to do is chores around your house, what have you. So appreciate you all being here. I was asked by the library, knowing I was home in Burlington, they said, why don't you come over and tell us a little bit about your friendship with Mr. Lincoln. And that's kind of bittersweet. Lincoln and I became very good friends for the last 13, 14 months of his life. And it's painful in some ways to know that he's gone, but at the same time, the friendship we developed is something that's long lasting, even past him being taken from us. You should know, I can't predict the future. My wife tries to predict the future quite often. Mrs. Grant has tried to rule me by premonition since our courting days. So if you're here as harbingers of my fate, just hold your breath for that. I know her far better than all of you combined, so I don't take her premonitions with any stock, so don't be offended if I don't take yours as well. Lincoln and I share a common bond in the fact that we're misunderstood to both hail from Illinois. It just happens that when he's made president, he's living in Illinois. And it just happens that when the war begins, I'm living in Illinois too. As you might know, Lincoln's from Kentucky, I'm from Ohio. So I think as Midwesterners, Lincoln and I, once we meet and get to talk a little, we find out how much we have in common in spite of our different paths as boys. Lincoln comes from a rather poor family. My family's not exactly the most well off, but my father Jesse is quite successful as a tanner. And that has a big influence on me as far as sticking to what you know, sticking to what you do well. And exploiting that to some degree as well. If I had half my father's business acumen, I probably would have not gone to the Army. I didn't go to the Army because I wanted to either. My father decided that was best for me because, as he put it to me, out of the 5 children and the oldest, he wanted me to have skills, kind of setting an example for my siblings along the way. Now, I've been breaking horses since I was a boy. In fact, the horse I came out from the station on is not broken correctly, so I'm going to take it back over to the livery and let them know about that when I'm done. But I thought I was set. Age 17, my father sits me down and says, "You're going to be a man soon. And what do you think you want to do with yourself?" I said, "Well, I make $10 a horse. There are jockeys that have come through Georgetown, where I'm growing up, to bring their horses over, the race horses from Kentucky. And if you know anything about a colicky horse, the best way to break the colic is to run it hard and sweat it. The jockeys that come to me when I'm in my teens, they tell me they get paid to race them. They don't get paid to run them when they're colicky, so I get paid to do that for them." So you can imagine being 13 years old and given the reins of a champion racehorse and told to run it hard, and you get $10 for that. So I'm trying to explain to my father when I'm 17 that this looks pretty good to me. To make this a career. I have no qualms about hopping on a fast horse anyway, but he says, "No, you need some skills." What do I need skills for? I have skills. "No, you're not going to raise a family on that." So he's already got plans for me along the way. And he tells me I'm going to go off to the military school at West Point. I'm a little crestfallen, because my first reaction to that, I asked him, why am I being punished? He says, "What do you mean punished?" "Well, sir, everybody knows you send the bad boys off to military school to give them some discipline and right their wrongs." So he said, "Oh, no, you're going to learn how to be an engineer, possibly a surveyor, or something along those lines." I said, "Well, it's really not what I want to do." And he said, "Well, I'd like you to stay with me and work in the tannery, but the way the process is to make leather, it's not something I can stomach." From the sights of it, from the smells of it, until I was about 10, pardon me for being gauche for a second, but urine is actually used in the tanning process for that time. So that just gives you some idea as to some of the aromas that will come from the tannery. And I have no desire on that, but out of the two, as my father wishes something, so I'll wish it too, that off I go to West Point. Now, kicking and screaming, mind you, but still. He tried to reassure me there'd be horses there. He also told me that most of the boys, and this is true, that once you complete your courses, you're not required to stay in the Army. And I find that out my first year. Several of the graduates get picked up by different railroads for surveying, construction, lighthouses being built, railroad tunnels and stations and what have you. So I'm not sure I want to do that either. I'd like to find something with horses. Now, what do you think about with the Army? What would be the branch of service that I might excel in? Cavalry. Oh yeah, and by the way too, if you have a question, folks that have never served in the Army, if you have a question about any of the military terms I use, please ask right away. And that goes with other things as well. I'd like this to be a conversation. If you're here to be lectured to, there might be a different room in the building. I've never been fond of lectures, either giving or receiving, so I'd like this to be a discussion there. Right, so the cavalry. Well, there's also, in 39, when I go to the academy, there's also the mounted rifles, what's called the dragoons. The dragoons is more the horse service. The cavalry kind of absorbs the dragoons into it. So there are 3 possibilities that I might find something I like about the Army, but there are a lot of them I don't. First of all, getting up early, the noise from banging drums and blowing horns and what have you. So I don't excel in marching. I don't excel in the military bearing portion of things. I have quite a few demerits, but I do finish 21 out of 39 in my class of 43. And I really thought what would seal the deal for me going to the cavalry was putting on a jumping exhibition at the graduation ceremony. We were in this long hall, all the graduates on horseback in this sawdust and dirt arena, and there's a bar put up about 3/4 of the way down, about 11 feet in the air. The stable master put that up. He walks over to me and he looks up and he says, "Cadet Grant, are you ready?" And my answer was yes. Now, my fellows on either side thought I meant that I'm ready to graduate, but I was ready for what was coming. Sergeant Hirschberger and I had worked this out. I'm on a sorrel named York, and York is probably the most unruly horse at the academy. Nobody can ride him when I arrive, but Sergeant Hirschberger tells me he's my special project, so I get this beautiful sorrel for all 4 years at the academy. So we know each other. And we come out from the line of troops, and we face onto this bar, and he announces that I'm going to vault the bar with the horse. 11 feet in the air. Not been done, as they said. The previous record was about 9 feet 7 inches, but he wanted to put it up a little bit more than that. And the horse and I coming up, you could feel the horse under me quickening. That I could feel, and he knew what was coming as well. And we left that bar, we cleared it. So, to my knowledge, to this day, today, in 1866, that record still stands. And I thought that would seal my fate in the cavalry. I was put in the infantry. And as we know, the infantry does a lot of walking. But we're all told, and it sounded like my father echoing the reassurances. He said, well, they told us, you officers, you'll have to buy a horse, but you'll still have one. But we have to walk a lot. So I'm not really happy about that, but I grin and bear it. So that's always been a good talking point with my son. My oldest boy, Fred, is 16. He's chomping at the bit himself to go off to the academy. He's confident because of my stature in the Army that we'll get him there. Buck, Jr., Ulysses Jr., he's content. The boys right now at home in Burlington, the last year or so that we've lived there, they've wormed their way into the Burlington College, and they drive the milk herd from the college off to a pasture very near the girls' school. That's tutoring my daughter Nellie all this time. So Buck is content with that for the moment, and I respect that because I know where I was when I was 14 as well. Little Nellie's getting schooled, and Jesse goes out and finds trouble the moment he's out of eye shot for many of us at the house. So family is secured there, but all of these things combine to show that you've got to make the most of what you're given. And I think that's something else about my friendship with Lincoln that endears us, because I do hear from him reports from him that he'll say that he's fascinated that I make do with what I have. There are other generals throughout the course of the war that are always asking for more. In fact, General McClellan, famously leading the Army of the Potomac and famously fired twice for not being as successful, had taken his time quite a few times that Lincoln had finally said to him, if you don't mind, I'd like to borrow the Army for a while since you're not using it. And I fell back on that when I was made General-in-Chief. I gathered my staff and I reminded them that Lincoln had said that to McClellan. I said, that never happens with my staff. And we all understood that would happen, did not happen. Throughout the career during the war itself, there are a lot of critics who come after me. They're jealous of my success. Other colleagues in the Army, they're not placed where they feel they should be, and they're a little resentful for me being placed where I am. And a lot of that has to do with the reputation I gained right before I quit the Army in '54. So it's a sensitive question to some, but as friends, we might be able to talk about that. And one of the first questions I get is, have I conquered my problem with drinking? And I'm not offended when I tell you I can answer that, because I've taken a temperance oath 3 different times. I found out early on, it took 3 times, but I finally defeated that. So yet another victory. Vicksburg wasn't taken in a day. That was a 6-month maneuver to take that. Petersburg falls eventually. All the other fights in the war fall much the same way. Patience and focus on what you need to do, and you overcome it. Taking the temperance oath was important when I came home from Mexico, because I found that I could only have 2 drinks before I lose control. I lived up to a name some friends gave me as a boy. My father always called me Ulysses, my middle name. My first name when I'm born is Hiram. So my friends would call me Hug, taking all 3 of my initials together. And I asked one boy not to call me Hug because Papa calls me Ulysses. And he smirked. He said, well, I'll just call you Useless then. Interesting thing with Jimmy was that I said, it's funny that you call me useless because you can barely cinch the saddle on your horse, yet I'm the one who broke it for you. So yet again, another lesson there, that you don't let other people's names for you define you. And I think that's something that the president caught on to as well, because he heard from all these people. In fact, he doesn't know me and I don't know him, in spite of us both hailing from Illinois. He's living in Springfield, I'm living in Galena. And he found humor in it when I would remind him I didn't vote for him. I didn't vote for him in 1860 just because I didn't vote, period. And 64, as General-in-Chief, I was in the field, and I couldn't get home to Illinois. And Illinois required their soldiers to go home to vote. Other states allowed votes from the field, but Illinois didn't work that way. So I directed with the War Department that as many soldiers from all the states that could go home, please allow them to do that, and I'll remain in the field. I was pretty confident there'd be enough boys from Illinois that would pick up the lack of me voting there. But had I voted, I probably would have supported the president. Not because I needed a job, just because I believed in what we were doing. And I've been asked about that a number of times. Until the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, it's not a war aimed to free slaves. The first purpose of putting down the rebellion is to restore the country. no matter which way we do that. The president said that to himself when he ran in 1860. Whether all slave or all free, so long as the Union is preserved. So, any of you who've served, we know what the directions are from the Commander-in-Chief. We know what the orders are from above, and we have somewhat of a luxury that we can put our personal feelings and our politics aside and simply follow the instructions we're given and obey the orders we're given and carry them out. Thus it is with the President. Although I do agree with his notions, until it's made official policy, it's not something that I have a primary focus on. Although, I'll share with you, Father Jesse is quite a firebrand abolitionist. He's a Whig who converts to being a Republican when the party is founded. And we had quite a few episodes with runaways coming through Georgetown from Kentucky through the Underground Railroad. And my father's friends, actually, with the eldest son of John Brown. You know how things turned out for John Brown. He had a good idea, and mine didn't execute it very well. So, those personal feelings aside, until that proclamation comes, it's not a war aim. Once the president makes it a war aim, it makes it easier to support, because if you have the same beliefs, you willingly and happily follow those orders as well. So I've never had a rub with the president on that at all. In fact, I don't know that we had much friction after we met. I'll tell you, until the capture of Vicksburg, we don't actually ever correspond. And until that point, he's actually directly corresponded with every general commanding an army, some of the corps commanders as well, except me. I'm the only one who's never reached out to until the capture of Vicksburg. And until that point, he's only been following my success from the papers and the people that he's had follow my army along to find out different things about me. So is there a question from that so far I can address from anybody? Yes.
So the point about McClellan is one that was often made about several of the generals that were previous to him or in different theaters.
Yes.
And one of the things that often I hear about is that that's what Lincoln liked about you, is that you always went straight ahead, and there wasn't a whole lot of considering whether we should go or not. There was a lot of
Right.
So what would you say why wasn't he communicating with you? If he really was, because he trusted you?
It might be because he trusts me. It might be that, and you probably can relate to this, if you're a manager or a shopkeeper, you have a worker who's doing their job. It's best to stay out of the way and let them do it, until they might need a course correction, and then you might step in. And that's the only thing I could presume from that, because when we meet, and I'm going to build you to that, because I want to give you some of the background to appreciate how important our friendship becomes. I'm unaware of his tracking of my success from the beginning. Now, when the war comes, I'm out of the army. In Galena, you probably had this here, volunteer regiments are called for, so somebody prominent that can finance it will put a company together, and they'll usually be elected the captain of that company. 10 companies are formed into a regiment, and whoever's financially stable that produces the regiment automatically becomes their colonel, regardless if they had any military training at all. So what I see in Galena, I see shopkeepers becoming captains, I see bankers and other prominent folks, judges and what have you, becoming colonels. And they stand in front of the men holding the manual. Now, what kind of confidence are you building in your troops if you're reading directly out of the manual? Oh, it says here to put your feet together. So I guess like that. So I'm literally seeing that sort of amateur production of soldiers, and it's frustrating. And I'm quiet about it. I don't make much of a fuss. So I rose up to captain throughout the war with Mexico. I was breveted twice from first lieutenant to captain for different personal valor actions, as they called it, in Mexico itself. So within the community of the young men in Galena, I became a bit of a war hero to them without even trying. There were Friday night sessions around the stove at my brother's tannery, because I worked for my brothers in their tannery the last year before the war started. I was their bookkeeper. My two younger brothers, by the way, because I had failed out as a farmer when I came home and asked my father for more money to raise my crops again. And he said, why don't you go work for your brothers? You'll have a stable job. And he was right. So I became a bookkeeper for them. Friday nights, everybody comes down to the tannery, and they want to hear from Captain Grant about Mexico. There's a congressman among them, Elihu Washburn, who's our local congressman, and he's aware of that as well, so he goes to the governor. When he's trying to raise his stature as a congressman and talks to him about the people in his different towns who should be the anchors for new regiments and mustering up troops. I'm more interested in going back in the regular army, not the volunteers. Now, you'll forgive me if you're a volunteer, but we, regular army, men. We've gone to West Point, so we're professionally trained. So if there's a bias there, I'm guilty of it, I'll admit to that. But I was holding out for a commission in the United States Army and not the volunteers. In fact, my friend Sherman was out of the Army at the same time. He finagled himself a commission as a brigadier general right off. Well, he's a colonel first, but he becomes a general in the regular Army before I do. So it's a bit of a rivalry between us, but it's a fun one at that. So I wrote a letter to the War Department, and I suggested after what I've seen of these volunteer regiments, and with my training, with my status as a graduate of West Point, and my experience in the war, I might make a good colonel. That letter never gets answered. In fact, it was found in one of the dovetail boxes on somebody's roll desk at the War Department about a week after Lee surrendered. Never responded to. Now, the only thing I can think about is somebody must have remembered my reputation from the old months. In Mexico, as I said, I learned how not to drink because it was always fun to give Sam another one, watch how he loses control. So I quelched that with the temperance oath when I get home. Julie and I got married in August of '48. In fact, our anniversary is coming up on the 22nd this month. I got to remember that. And took the oath. Our boy Fred's born in '50. My regiment is called from the Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis to go to California. And our purpose, and I find this so cockeyed and skewed, our purpose is to go to the frontier and protect the settlers from the savages up around Fort Humboldt on the northern coast of California. So off we go. But before we go, Julia reveals to me, and I knew this was coming anyway, that she's expecting another child. So the thought is, and this is by 52, or it's close to 52, it's late 51. The idea is that if she comes along, it might be difficult for her with the pregnancy, because families are allowed to go. The enlisted men pay for their family, or rather are paid to bring their families. We officers, like everything else, we have to pay for every bit of it. Our uniforms, our equipment, everything, including our traveling family. So I told her to wait with my family in Ohio, and I would send for her after the baby's born. We're settled up in California. So I get there, and there are no savages. There are friendly natives, and quickly bond because they love horses as much as I do. So I'm out riding with a lot of them anyway, and that's pretty pleasant. And I start working up the money to bring the family out as quartermaster, as supply officer. And how I went from infantry to supply, that might be a story for another day. But the fact is, as quartermaster, I'm responsible for supplying everything the regiment needs, whether from local supply or from the government. And I find out if I raise crops, I can charge the Army for that, feeding the troops and getting some money. That can become the foundation of the fund that brings the family in. So I'm enthused about that. July '52, I get a letter from Julia that my second son is born. She sends the whole letter. The last page of it, she mentions nothing about the baby until the last page of the letter. And all that's on the last page is a hand tracing of little Ulysses' hand. And she wrote above it, by the way, this is the handprint of your namesake and your second son, Ulysses S. Grant Jr. So I was over the moon about that. I carried that letter in my pocket till it fell apart. Because I pull it out every time somebody asks me, why are you so worried about raising all this money and everything else? I pull that letter out and say, I'm going to see my boy. I haven't seen him. Never haven't seen him. In fact, I wrote to her and I said, ask little Liz what the S stands for in his name. She never answered that part of it. So it seems like a nice goal. It seems like it's a pleasant aspiration. Crops fail. Friends and I raise chickens because down in San Francisco, the hotels and restaurants are screaming for poultry. So we raise chickens to send down, plus for the Army. And we load them up on one of the boats, and down they go. They don't feed the chickens. Chickens die. Restaurants won't pay for dead chickens. That fails. In the wintertime, we need ice. All right, we'll go up to the hills, pack ice into barrels, and send that off. We should have checked what ship we sent it on, because probably the same ship that didn't feed the chickens took their time going down to San Francisco. And I got a letter back from one of the hotels, and they said, nobody is ever going to want to drink water from the hills of California. So why are you not sending us ice? Well, that failed as well. So I became more despondent on the frontier, developed a really bad attitude. And I think we can relate to that at some point, maybe in our teen years, maybe into our 20s, where we're making bad choices. And when we're warned by our friends about it, we say 3 words: I don't care. Can we relate to that? Maybe we, if not ourselves, we know somebody that's been in that situation. And I was to that point where I didn't care. Besides being quartermaster, I was made paymaster. So I'm handing out the money every month to the troops on payroll. You are not to be drunk when you do this. Clearly posted in the manual. But I'm warned of that. Like, why do you have a bottle next to you while you're handing out the money? I don't know. Does it matter? Well, that's a court-martial offense. And you know what I said? I don't care. And I got to the point where every month it just happened, and I had a little bit of an outburst in front of the men, and I said, you know, it doesn't matter to me. All that money's going to them. None of the money's going for me to bring my family out here. And that was the wrong thing to say. Does not garner confidence in the men you're trying to lead, and certainly doesn't look good for the officers in general. So I was invited to face a court-martial over being drunk on duty or resign. And I thought hard about it. My friends convinced me they would fight for me in a court-martial, and I said, no, I'll go home. I haven't seen Fred since I left. He's 2 now. I haven't seen my second son. He probably won't even recognize me, won't know who I am. So I quit the Army. Now here's the fun part of that. I resigned from the Army in 1854, a week after I submitted the letter while I'm packing up to leave. Received notice from the War Department, courtesy of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, that my commission as a captain in the regular Army had been approved. So all that back pay for 2 years after moving to the frontier was going to be coming my way, but in transit, I sent a letter saying I quit.
Oh.
See, this is why I tell you, if I had half of my father's business acumen, I would have thought this through. Father Jesse, who writes letters to the editor and brags on things all the time, he wrote right to Jeff Davis and demanded they allow me to stay in. He said, my son's out of his mind, he doesn't know what he's doing. I asked him to stay out of the way. Just let me go home and see my family. So I got home, took the temperance oath again, and everything's fine. Freddie was not sure because all of the time on the frontier I grew my beard. So he wasn't sure until he heard my voice. Now, Junior, Buck, he had no idea who I was. So it took a little while to warm him up and get back to him. So in that period between 54 and when we moved to Galena in 57, I failed with farming there. I had raised a wheat crop, but there was a recession that brought the prices down. So lost my shirt on that. I was selling wood on street corners after I was fired from being a rent collector. Julia's family, on her mother's side, the Boggs family, her uncle had a rent collection firm, and they hired me on to collect rent. And there was a poor old woman who couldn't afford it, and I paid for her rent, feeling bad for her. He told me I lacked the killer instinct. Fired me. Who can know these things, right? I know I don't want to take the predictions, because who knows? But, yeah, so fired from that. I pawned my watch that Christmas. I was selling wood on street corners from my land, and asked for money from my father. He said, go work for your brothers. He said, you bring that southern wife of yours and your children north, is how it put it. A little bit of friction there. I could talk for hours about the tactful, delicate, diplomatic discussions between her father and I when we were recording, because her father's a slave. So you can understand in Missouri how that would rub again. So I was relieved to get away from that environment. Julia was a little unsure. But we move up to Galena, and as I bring you back now to these bull sessions around the stove on Friday nights, all these people want to hear about my exploits in Mexico. Congressman Washburn alerts the governor that you have a military hero, as he puts it, a genuine military hero right here in Galena who could assist you. So I was summoned to Springfield, not to be commissioned, but because I'm waiting for my letter from the War Department. But I'm asked to assist the formations of these companies that are coming in. So these young men who were made captains and their lieutenants who know nothing about military service, I'm showing them how to fill out their paperwork. Well, I was a quartermaster, so why not? But along the way, I'm trying to give them a little bit of military instruction as far as, here's the proper way you should stand in front of your troops. Here's a little bit of training out of the manual. And there's 2 or 3 of them that have some West Point experience that really, really appreciate that, and that comes back around. After about setting up 2 or 3 regiments, I'm frustrated that I'm not getting back in the Army. So I went over to Ohio because McClellan, of all people, is placed in Ohio as the military district supervisor. So I thought as a fellow West Pointer, I'd be able to work in, because we all thought when all things started, this is way before Lincoln said, I'd like to borrow the Army, everybody looked up to McClellan. He had been over in the Crimea as an observer during that war in the 1850s. And he wrote a lot of extensive papers about that. Particularly fascinating was how he said that the railroads would become a significant part of military strategy. He was right about that. So we all thought we need to hop on McClellan's coattails. So I thought maybe as a West Pointer that I'd be able to do that. And he wouldn't see me. That might stem from an incident on the frontier. So before that pay call, that caused my resignation. He was out in the West on a mapping expedition, came by for supplies at Fort Humboldt, and did not appreciate that I was drunk when I was handing out supplies to his men. That might be why he didn't bother coming out to see me as well. So I come back to Galena. Well, it's 1861 at this point. I just turned 39. Looks like I'm going to let the war go by. And got a telegram from the governor. Please come to Springfield. I must see you. I get down to see the governor, and I'm in a suit, worn out suit. I don't know that I ever have a new suit ever, like I'll ever need one. But I go in to see the governor, and he says, "Colonel, I'm glad you're here." And I looked at him and said, "Colonel, some of you call me president here. It's the same reaction." I said, "What do you mean, Colonel? Did I get my commission from the governor?" No, I have one for you. Well, you know, sir, I'm tactful about it, but I'm really waiting for the government to bring me back in. And he said, "Well, I need you. Here's the letter I want you to read." It came from all the company commanders of the 21st Illinois Regiment, so 10 captains, and also their lieutenants. And there's 2 lieutenants and a captain to each company, so that's 30 officers. They wrote up this letter complaining about their colonel, whose name is Good, G-O-O-D-E. And towards the end of it, they said, "We really feel that he's not inculcating good military habits in our men. He gets drunk with the sentries, takes them to town Mattoon, where they're near, and picks fights with the railroad workers there, and thinks that that's the way he's going to bond with his men." So at the end of that, they said, our summary of that is that Colonel Good isn't. Right there in the print. And they said, "We as a body believe that Captain Grant would make a better colonel. And from what we've come to know of him, we would respect that and stay. If we don't have a good colonel, we're all as a body planning to resign." And I would have been, you can liken that to, what I tried to get my boys to understand was, say there's a bad headmaster at the school, and all the teachers say they don't want to work for that headmaster. How are you going to have that school even run at that point? So, in a generic way, how is your regiment going to function without the captains and lieutenants? Now, there are sergeants, don't get me wrong, the sergeants run the Army, and I'll concede that, but you need those officers in that middle echelon of command. And I quickly understood that this regiment's going to dissolve if I don't accept this. And I was about to say, well, I think I'll have to go home and mull this over with Mrs. Grant. And he had 2 colonel's shoulder straps in his hand. He says, "Well, I have these ready for you if you're willing to take them now." Didn't look like the Army was going to set me back in at that point. So I became a volunteer colonel. Elihu Washburn, the congressman, he jumped all over that. He starts honking that back in Washington, that we have a bona fide war hero who's back of the Army, and he predicts that I'm going to rise up rather quickly. Well, I don't know that he knew this or not, but Lincoln told the governor of Illinois he could have 4 more brigadier generals in his ranks. I guess because he came from Illinois, he can kind of favor Illinois a little bit more, and it's always nice for him politically to do things like that. So the governor decided that I would be one of the new 4 brigadier generals made out of that invitation. Now, I had no idea. In fact, I was with my regiment out of Springfield in the training camp, preparing them to go do what we're supposed to go do. And the chaplain from our regiment came over to me and handed me the paper. He said, "Turn to page 4 and look on the second column." And there was a list of promotions for Illinois. And I was one of the generals on it. So I found out from a newspaper that I was made a general. I was given a brigade. So I'm a 1-star general at this point, without having led troops in the battle, without really showing myself or proving myself. And off we go, because very soon after that, it's October now of 1861, there's not been a lot of fighting. We all know the first fight. The first fight is the Philippine races in Western Virginia. And then the most famous fight in the East at that point is the first fight at Bull Run. And that doesn't go well for the Army there. It's disappointing for Lincoln. So he's anxious for the Western theater to show itself. He's a Westerner himself, as we say. And General Fremont, a founder of the Republican Party, the Pathfinder of California, as he's been called, he's anxious to show that his military department, he's a political general, he's a major general, politician in uniform, he's anxious to show that his department is going to lead the charge. And not knowing that, I stepped in anyway and said, "My men are ready. We're ready for action. The Army's been built to go fight the war, so my troops are ready to do that." "Well, this is great, because I've been looking for somebody like you," he says. And we're sent down along the Mississippi River in Missouri to a place called Belmont. My troops go ashore. I'm at the front of them. all 9,000 of them, and my heart is leaping up my throat because I'm mulling over in my head, I've never led troops in battle. I was a quartermaster. Well, what am I doing in front of all these men? I've never drawn my sword and led a charge. I've never given a command to fire. And how will I do? So I'm a little unsure of things, and I'm tempted to turn everybody back, get back on our transports on the river, go back up and say we couldn't find the Rebs. Our mission was to engage 2 regiments who were camped along the Mississippi by this town of Belmar. Now, when we came up on their position, because I held on, something said, just go and see. And we get up to where their camp was, and they're gone. They skedaddled when they heard we were coming, which was great for us because it looked like a great victory. Our men started pillaging their camp. Some of them came back out because they were still along the road where they saw us tearing through things. And not that we were routed, but we had to make a tactical withdrawal back to our ships. But the North hails it as a bit of a victory. Of course, Congressman Washburn from Illinois goes to the president and he puts down the newspaper and says, hey, one of your Illinois generals has just distinguished himself routing these rebels on the river. So that's the first time that Lincoln is even aware of my name. This is November '61. Well, that success gives me more troops to command, gives me a higher position. I'm put in charge of 6 divisions of men. And our acting general-in-chief, Henry Halleck, who's commanding actually in the Western Theater, he tells me that he'd like to see our troops go on an expedition up the Tennessee River and engage some of the forts. Because in Tennessee itself, capital of Nashville is kind of in the center, and it's along the Cumberland River. And the Tennessee River, snaking off the Mississippi, connects to that. So to get to the capital, you've got to go upriver, and rebels have forts along these rivers. So the first fort we're going to engage is Fort Henry. Fort Henry is a poorly made fort. I was looking at the foundation here when I came in, and much of Fort Henry is below ground level, right next to the Cumberland River, or the Tennessee River, rather. So, kind of porous. The fort itself is not well built, and their gunners aren't very good at what they do. I don't have to disembark, not even 1 regiment of the 6 divisions I have, because the Navy brought in gunboats and pounded that fort into submission. The next fort upriver from there on the Cumberland River itself is at Fort Donelson, right near the town of Dover. And most of the men that were at Fort Henry skedaddled and went up to there. Now we engaged them there. We fight them outside the fort. We push them into the fort, and there's about 30,000 Rebs that are in this fort. And they have 3 different commanders among them. And the principal commander was my division commander in Mexico, General Pillow. And I don't know that I think much of General Pillow. In Mexico, one of the incidents where I got promoted, I managed to get a artillery piece into a church tower to clear off the Mexicans that were on rooftops in the town where we couldn't get through the town. And I was promoted to captain because of my action of getting that cannon up in there. It was my friend John Pemberton at the time, who was a captain in the Army with me at that point in Mexico. He popped up in the door of the church tower and said, Sam, this is fabulous. General Pillow said you should get another gun up here. Well, I'm standing in about the space of that bell tower. The gun itself is about this long, and it's about this wide. There's only room for the 1 gun, let alone the 4 men serving in it myself. So General Pillow doesn't quite understand these things, but he's somehow in charge of these rebel troops. He elects to leave it to a subordinate commander who knows me better, Simon Bulwer Buckner. So General Pillow, General Tillman, and Nathan Bedford Forrest all break out and go upriver towards Nashville to get away, and they leave 30,000 men behind with my friend Simon Buckner, who's proposing terms to me to surrender. Well, my answer to him was there are no terms but an unconditional and immediate surrender. And I further wrote that I propose to move upon your works immediately. I've got 6 divisions, he's got 30,000 men, so I outnumber him by a fair bit. And he accepts the terms, but begrudgingly accepts the terms. He reminds me when we meet to talk about things that he loaned me money when I quit the Army. When I come back from California, I had to come through New York, and on my way home, I was in New York City, and I ran out of money. Couldn't pay the hotel bill, and Buckner was there at Brooklyn. So he offered to cover my hotel bills until my father could wire me a bill to get home from there. He never let me forget it. But I offered him my purse right there. I said, my purse is yours, sir. And he said, no, that's beyond the point. These terms are unacceptable. I said, well, it's what you get. It's an unconditional surrender. Now, from that, the papers picked up on that whole thing. My initials are U.S. for Ulysses S. The terms I gave were an unconditional surrender. So the newspapers made that connection, started calling me unconditional surrender grant. And that's how Congressman Washburn goes back to President Lincoln. So he says, your grant man from Illinois, well, he's won here, and now he's captured a whole rebel army. That's the first time that's happened in the war at that point. And it doesn't happen for any other commander. In fact, it happens 3 times overall for me leading armies. So you can understand why these other officers might be jealous of me along the way, because my reputation is that I'm a drunk and I'm a failure. He quit the army because he was drinking, and here he is now capturing all these armies. Why, and well, it's got to be a mistake. That's the prevailing notion of that. But what comes back from Lincoln, when he hears about these things, he's happy about the victory, and when he starts getting criticism about me from folks, he says, well, I can't spare Grant, he fights. Like you said, he's really focused on who's being successful. So now he's more aware of my progress. He's definitely aware of who I am. I do get correspondence from Secretary of War, and if it's directed from the President, it will say on behalf of the President, and it goes on from there from the Secretary of War. So nothing directly from Lincoln at that point, which is curious. The fight at Pittsburgh Landing comes next April, '62, and we win there. It's a horrible fight. We lose 22,000 men in a 2-day fight. The only thing that rivals that will come in September the same year at Antietam, where we lose 22. Not me so much, but the Army loses 22,000 men in 1 day's fight. So never have we conceived that number of casualties. And just to give you a basic statistic on that, when Cornwallis surrendered to Washington, Washington had 9,000 men in his army. 9,000 men received the surrender of the British to end the revolution. We lose 22,000 in that fight there. So it's a tremendous loss of life. Nothing to be proud of. It's regretful in several ways, in all ways. But it's hailed as a victory until those casualty counts come out in the newspapers. And some photographs are shown of the dead on the field. So then there's criticism. And my immediate commander, General Halleck, takes me out of command and makes me his second in command. And as a second in command, some of you that are assistant managers may relate to this. I did a lot of what I was doing outside when you all came up, walking in circles and smoking. There wasn't anything for me to do as an assistant commander. I just sat around. Now, Lincoln at this point, the report came that he followed our success at Pittsburgh Landing. He weathered the casualty count because of the success of it. We fought there, not because we chose to fight right there. It's very similar in a parallel kind of way to the fight at Gettysburg. Nobody fought at Gettysburg because of that being a strategic point. They fought there because that's where the armies met. We fought at Pittsburgh Landing because that's where the armies met. Our true goal was south of there into Tennessee, or rather into Mississippi, at this railroad junction called Corinth. 5 different railroads come in. The rebels have a garrison there and a supply yard, and we were marching off the Tennessee River to get there. And we came in on Pittsburgh Landing. And the Rebs, not following doctrine, came out from their defenses to meet us and cut us off before we could get there. And that's why the fight happens where it does. Still, the goal is to get to Corinth. But I'm not in charge anymore. And I'm walking in circles and smoking and wondering what I'm going to get to do next. Up to the point I'm frustrated by it because Halleck, by the way, does anybody know General Henry Halleck's nickname? Some of these men have colorful nicknames.
Old slow trot.
Well, not slow trot. He is a paper general. I'll give you a hint though. He can recite the training manual. He can recite Jomini's tactics manual, song and verse, tell you the page number or something. He's old brains. He's old brains because he just has it all locked into his head to follow the book in every way. And he does this between Corinth and coming down from the Pittsburgh Landing. It's 12 miles. And the manual tells you if you're in enemy country, if you're unsure for the safety of your army, proceed until you feel safe enough, put up breastworks, and then patrol the area before you move any further. And he does this for 2.5 weeks to go 12 miles. Lincoln's frustrated. Lincoln's asking the War Department, why hasn't, in his words, why hasn't Grant taken Corinth? He's unaware that I've been relieved. Now Sherman comes to me, because I'm at my tent, I'm packing everything up, I'm folding papers up. You know about cutting through red tape? That comes from the Army, because we use red tape to tie up all our official bundles. So I'm literally tying bundles up with red tape, and Sherman comes in and goes, Sam, where do you think you're going? So I'm packed, I'm leaving. I'm going home, I'm useless here. I'm living up to that nickname. at this point. And he says to me, no, you need to reconsider. He says, if you go home, things will go on without you, and we'll probably be fine. But at the same time, a happy accident could occur that will restore you to command. Well, that happy accident was Lincoln's frustration with Halleck, where sometimes people who don't do a good job are promoted upward, or kicked upstairs, as we say. And Halleck is promoted and made acting general-in-chief and sent to Washington. And I think that was Lincoln's way to not ruffle his feathers so much and still use his brains, but send him out of the way. And I'm given command of that region between Tennessee and Mississippi. So now I'm restored. And we take Corinth within a matter of days. And everything is all set there. So now Lincoln is satisfied. He's got a commander who's taking action again. And again, when you're successful, you get rewarded with more responsibility. And that's what happens in Mississippi at that point. Halleck is all about being my friend now. And he's telling me, I have full support of the government and the War Department and anything I want to do next. And I said, well, I want to go after Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, why do I want to go after Vicksburg, Mississippi? You know how the Mississippi River flows. You obviously know where it starts and it cuts through the center of the country. The rebels refer to Vicksburg as the linchpin that holds the South together. Vicksburg itself, until you get north to Memphis, it's the only point on the Mississippi with high ground alongside the river, and it's 300 feet above the river. That means they control the flow of the river. Not only that, there's a bend in the river that curves around to Vicksburg, so they control that bend in the river and everything coming from the south and everything coming from the north. Summer of '62, the Navy tried to invest Vicksburg by itself. Any sailors here? Any sailors here today? Because I want to thank the Navy, because without the Navy, we wouldn't have taken Donaldson, we wouldn't have taken Vicksburg, and we probably would not have won the war. So it was out to the Navy and their Marines for what they did for us, because it was the first time in my theater of the war where the Navy and the Army could coordinate and work together. And this really proves itself coming into Vicksburg. But the Navy tried it by themselves. Farragut and Porter both. And they said it's going to have to be a combined operation. So I knew in my planning, I'm going to have to reach out to the Navy. I'm going to need their help. It's a river city. And it controls everything that flows. Jeff Davis calls it the Gibraltar of the West. Lincoln calls it the key to victory. And Lincoln says, I want that key in my pocket. So the word comes back that I've decided I want to go after that. So I have full endorsement from the government to go after Vicksburg. And it takes a lot of planning. We begin the campaign in February '63, and we capture it. The request to surrender it comes on July 3rd, 1863. The true surrender then is on July 4th. July 3rd is the same day that Lee was being kicked out of Gettysburg. So it's pretty significant for Lincoln that he's got major victories. First time the Army of the Potomac proves they can beat Lee, which is important in Virginia, and needs a good commander to do that. And in the West now, Lincoln writes about it, and he says, once more, due to General Grant and his army, the Mississippi flows unvexed to the sea. And believe me, I could talk to you hours about Vicksburg. There's a lot of things that went into that, but that's not the point today. I did mention to you how Lincoln had not written to me directly. Well, still Lincoln. It's not the first time I've dropped a cigar in the dirt, or in a stable. If it's a good cigar, you overlook it. I did tell you that Lincoln had not written to me. I think I mentioned it that the first time he writes to me is after Vicksburg. A week or two after we settled in, it was too hot in Mississippi. I had sent Sherman off with his corps to go after Joe Johnson, who was hovering east of Vicksburg, out past Jackson, the capital, 30 miles away. And I repeatedly sent letters to Sherman asking him why he wasn't pressing Joe Johnson. And his reply was, tell Grant it's too damn hot out here. So we settled into just waiting out. It's kind of like the opposite of the winter. You can't fight in the winter because of snow and whatnot. In Mississippi in July and into August, you don't want to be fighting. Nobody wants to be fighting either side. So we settle in. My family comes down. We're in a home right in Vicksburg itself, not far from the Warren County Courthouse. Sherman sets up a tent house. He's got 5 sergeants' tents set up for his family along the Big Black River. So we cordially invite each other for dinner and visit each other. And in the course of that, I get this letter from the president. So when Sherman comes and we sit down, he and some of my other staff, I sit down and say, I want to share with you what the president sent me. Now Sherman, although he met the president early on, he's kind of dubious of the president's aims. When he first came back in the Army, he was given colonelcy. When he was made a brigadier general, he went directly to the president and told him he didn't want command. He would be satisfied being somebody's assistant commander. I guess he wants to walk in circles and smoke cigarettes. Well, he was given the assistant command for General Anderson. Anderson had been Major Anderson at Fort Sumter, was made a general. He was in charge of the troops in Kentucky where there wasn't a lot of fighting. There was one fight, though, that spooked Anderson to the point that he resigned. So when he resigned, guess who was made commander there? Sherman. So Sherman looked at the president and said, "This is all your fault." So he's a little bit sketchy with Lincoln's motives at this point. But I wanted to share this letter. So Lincoln wrote to me, "My dear General, I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgement for the almost inestimable service you have done the country. I wish to say a word further. When you first reached the vicinity of Vicksburg, I thought you should do what you finally did. March the troops across the neck, run the batteries with the transports, and thus go below," which was all part of our maneuvering. We couldn't get at Vicksburg from above because it's all swamps and bayous and what have you. Couldn't get at it from 300 feet bluffs on the river. So we either had to come directly below it, across rolling hills they could defend, which is what we didn't do, but what we actually did then was go east of it, cut the rail connection at Jackson, and then march over and invest Vicksburg, pitting it against the river with the Navy. So he's writing all of this here about how he has doubts about what's going on in the campaign. So he says, "I never had any faith except in the general hope that you knew better than I that the Yazoo Pass expedition, which was in the north on the Yazoo River, and the like, could succeed. When you got below, there were two garrisons at Fort Gibson and Grand Gulf. I thought you should go down the river and join General Banks, one of our other political generals, who was fighting on the Red River by Baton Rouge." Lincoln had thought at that point, I had my army together, maybe it's more prudent to take them away from Vicksburg, join up with Banks, help him, and then bring the combined force north. I would have nothing of it. There's a nice thing I like to remind people that the farther you are from the flagpole, the better. And the general that's at the front knows better than anybody in the rear in a comfortable chair. And everybody back at Washington didn't know the situation around Vicksburg. And when I had the momentum, it was more important to keep the army moving rather than stop that, give the rebels time to regroup and defend, and go somewhere else. So I kept pushing. There were letters coming from the War Department. There were plenty of letters, and one telegraph could get through, from the War Department saying the president is anxious of your success. The president suggests you do the following. And of course, well, you know, we're in the field. We still get telegraph. Didn't see those messages. But he has to make his point that he's sharing that fear with me. So he says, "Go below, join General Banks, and when you turn northward east of the Big Black River," which is the river just east of Vicksburg itself, he says, "I feared it was a mistake." That's where Sherman cracked up. Sherman started to laugh somewhat hysterically. He said, "Well, I guess the commander-in-chief isn't, after all those books he pulled out of Congress, or the Library of Congress, I guess he still doesn't understand strategy." So he had a laugh over that. I said, "Sherman, that's not the end of the letter. There's one more important thing I want to share with you. This really is the beginning of our friendship, I firmly believe." His last sentence to me, he wrote, "I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong." Yours very truly, A. Lincoln. You see why I still carry this one around. And Sherman snapped it out of my hand. He said, "You made that up." He said, "You were right. You were right. He was wrong." Well, I think I could be his friend. He hands it back to me. He said, "Oh, you like him again." So thus begins the friendship. Now the thing about that letter, the president lays out, "I'm commander-in-chief. You're one of my generals." Everything goes off what the commander-in-chief says to do, right? If you're not doing what he wants, he's perfectly legal in his position to tell you, "No, that's not what I want as your commander-in-chief," and you are expected to abide that rule. He never once deliberately ordered me off. He made suggestions. So he wanted to see where I was going to go with it, possibly. And here we are, we captured Vicksburg. And he writes that in a letter to me that I was right and he was wrong. You know what's going to happen the following November? The election. Now here he is writing a letter to probably his most successful general in the field. I've captured now at that point 2 rebel armies. We captured 32,000 troops at Vicksburg. And we took the city, opening up the flow of the Mississippi as well. And here he is going into the election site, where he's being criticized for the war dragging on and the casualty counts and everything that goes with that. And his most successful general has just captured another place. Some of you who said I should be president, because one of you said they're talking about it. I know they're talking about it. Believe me, they've been talking about it since Vicksburg. We had people come down to Vicksburg from both parties. The Democrat Party wanted me to run against them. elements of the Republican Party suggested I be placed as the nominee instead of Lincoln, because they were frustrated with the war. Both parties, their delegates said to me, no one knows better how to end the war than a general who's winning. Now, of course, they're all looking at they want Lincoln out. And I can't abide that. He's the commander-in-chief. He's my boss. You know, so from the military side, remember I said we have the luxury of not inserting politics. I'm looking at it purely from that point that it would seem to me it's insubordination. It seems it's almost mutiny that I would run against the commander-in-chief. So I can't do that. Then regardless of party, I can't do that. I wouldn't go with the Democrat Party anyway because of their outlook on slavery. They want the war to end and they want slavery to just kind of continue peaceably where it exists, as they put it. And I'm not going to abide that as well. But I'm not going to exactly take over from Lincoln either. Yes.
Question. Didn't you own a slave or two?
I've owned 3 men. And that's not something I went out and bought. Okay? Those men were gifted to me by my father-in-law out of the 30 men and women he owns. Julia has 5 servants when we meet. When I come home from the war, or rather when I come home from California, and I start my farm up, my father-in-law, Colonel Dent, the Kentucky colonel from Virginia, gives me three men to work the farm. And first of all, when I started dating his daughter, courting her, he said to me, "You're never going to marry her because she'll never live the life of an army wife. That's not fitting for his eldest daughter." So he's never had any confidence. So well, I married her, and then when I start my farm up, he says, "You're not going to ever be a good farmer, and I'll give you 3 of the best workers I have, and I'll prove it to you. You won't be." Well, I spent a year and a half trying to find out where to take them to emancipate, enumerate. And I found out from my farming neighbor, John Bowen, who was a subordinate general for Pemberton at Vicksburg, by the way. He told me when I asked him, I said, "Where do I take these men to free them?" He said, "Why on earth would you want to do that?" "Well, because they're men. Because I don't believe that they should be slaves. I'm paying them to work my farm as so as it is, and that really irks my father-in-law, by the way." He says, "Well, you take them anywhere. You take barrels and donkeys and wagons and everything else that's property to transfer it. You take them to the property office in St. Louis." So, took the 3 men to St. Louis, told them they were going to be freed. Came out of the building with their papers. 2 of them couldn't write. So they just put X's where their names were. Willie Jones, he could write. He stays on and works my farm as a paid employee. The other 2 men went off to work the riverboats. But people have cats at home? There are house cats and indoor cats. Have you ever opened a door on an indoor cat to see what it would do? It just kind of stares, right? It just looks out kind of horrified. Like, well, I don't want to go there. The two men who didn't read, who couldn't read and write, were terrified. They didn't know what to do with themselves. So you're free, you can go. If you want to come back and work the farm, I'll still pay you to work, but you're free. So they had to adjust to that. So that was a pleasant shock to see their faces. So when I got home with them, or from that, I said to Julia, "They're all set free, and I'd like you to do that with your servants." Now, Victorian women, this may be different, hard for you to accept, but Victorian women are programmed and expected to obey their husbands. It might be a little shocking because some of your cultures and norms might be different. And I don't have a problem with that. Julia and I have quite democratically managed our house for years. But it was one of the times that I pulled rank on her. And I said, "I want you to free these people, and if you're going to keep them, you're going to pay them." She didn't want to budget for 5, so she kept her favorite servant, and her name is also Julia. My Julia is 5'2". Her servant Julia is about 4 foot tall. Now, when I call for Julia, I'm normally calling for my wife if I'm not in the right room. Her servant Julia would come in, and Julia herself said one time, "This is too confusing, Mr. Grant. Why don't you all just call me Brown Julia? Then we'll know the difference along the way." So Brown Julia stays on with Julia until we moved up to Galena, because Willie and Julia stayed in Missouri when we moved up north. They were afraid that fugitive hunters would come after them, even though they had their papers. So they didn't stay on. But it's true enough. I did have possession of 3 people, but in my heart and in my eyes, I never saw that I owned them because I paid them to be with me along the way, and I was extremely happy when I could finally set them free that way. And not to mention the look on my father-in-law's face when I did. My own father was happy about that. I'll tell you that. So, yes.
Did your relationship with your father-in-law change as it
Does my relationship with my father-in-law change? No. No, I think I think it's inflamed a little bit, and it has to do more with Julia's mother passing last year at 65. So he's hurt by that, but then he's embittered that his beloved South is no longer going to have slaves as well. And he sees his son-in-law as the architect of that, because as General-in-Chief, I'm presiding over an army that freed slaves. And that's another part of the Vicksburg campaign. Everywhere the armies of Tennessee went through Mississippi, every plantation we came up on, if the slaves weren't already free, they became free the instant blue uniforms showed up. And a lot of the families who owned those farms had skedaddled and left the slaves there working.
Yeah.
And the slaves stayed because they didn't know anything else, so they worked the farms
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
And I would see to it that the army was buying what they produced along the way. So we were kind of encouraging self-emancipation by the presence of the army in Mississippi. So father-in-law, not very happy with that. And that kind of spreads as I move up in rank as well, of course, too. But that friction is the friction. It doesn't matter that he told me I couldn't marry his daughter, I did. So there it is. So at this point, Vicksburg is captured. Lincoln admits to me. And I knew there was a political bend behind it because there were two men from the War Department had come along. And the other part of this, besides being looked at to run for president, the Congress has talked to the president about reviving the rank of lieutenant general. Now, what does that mean? No one's worn the rank with 3 stars on it since George Washington. And it's been like an unspoken rule that nobody dare outrank General Washington. Father of our country. You can't imagine anybody outranking him. But the Congress says that there's too much frustration, and they have this group called the Committee on the Conduct of the War. In fact, next week when they get back from their furlough, I have to go before them and tap dance, as we all say. And I'm not a good dancer, but I'll make the face. They have come to see in all these committee meetings and all their investigations of how the war is being carried out, there's a lot of discrepancies about who's in command. Because you have everybody in command wearing 2 stars. And when we all get together, the first thing people start asking is, when did you go to West Point? When were you promoted? So everybody's counting hash marks. They want to see who has date of rank, who is senior in rank. If two men went to the same class, well, I was 3rd, well, I was 17. Well, then I'm in command. So there's a lot of that kind of bickering going on amongst the generals. And the Congress finds out about that. They address it through the War Department, and Secretary Stanton tells them it's none of their business. He's a little brisk. And goes to the president. And the president says, well, what do you want to do with that? And the Congress says, we're keen on reviving this rank of lieutenant general if you approve of that. The president says, I'd like to find somebody for the job. And unbeknownst to me, I'm actually being considered by the president. But again, there's friction because there's generals who are jealous. There are temperance organizations who are following up on all these allegations of me being drunk everywhere. And again, that comes up for why are we having all these victories? We're doing things that are not in the book. We're using tactics and strategy not within the manual. And the first thought is, well, that's got to be because he's drinking. If he wasn't drinking, he'd read the book. Or why do we have so many casualties? Well, he probably is so drunk he doesn't care. So, and all that goes back in the president's ear. So the president says to some of the temperance men, well, you can go down, we're sending men down to see him anyway, you can go along and report back to me what you see him drinking. Now the story goes that when they came back to him and said they weren't sure what it was, and I talked to Lincoln about this the first hour that we met, I had to know. Now what they say to him is they couldn't tell if I was even having a drop. What Lincoln reportedly said back to them was, it's too bad you can't tell me what he's drinking. I was going to order barrels of it for the other generals. They win battles just like Grant. Now this is one of the most endearing things about Lincoln. If you know anything about Lincoln, he loves to tell stories. And when you have any meetings with him, and I've seen this with his cabinet, because I've been invited to cabinet meetings, and we're all huddled up outside the second floor cabinet room, and then we're ushered in, and you can see Stanton leading charge. He's always, you mentioned he's brisk. But many of them, Seward especially, they come in and they're like, because they know Lincoln's going to tell stories. It might be a meeting that you could probably accomplish what you wanted in 5 minutes, but you're going to hear from the president about so-and-so's dog. You're going to hear about so-and-so cutting an apple tree. You're going to hear all these crazy stories. But in those stories, if you're paying attention, he's actually talking about the subject of the meeting by what he's talking about. And what I asked him when I met him was, did you really tell those men you'd send barrels? And he said, you know, I read that in the paper, sure I said. It's so endearing that he would put it that way. He didn't want to be tied down to. He's a very astute politician. So that comes from that point. Secretary Stanton had sent down Charles Danner from the War Department. He too was there to investigate. He told me he was there to investigate a pay discrepancy amongst the troops from Iowa, and Illinois. Now I know from being a quartermaster, all you need is an abacus, a couple of blank sheets of paper, and a sharp pencil, and you can resolve a pay problem in about an hour. But he's with us for 3 weeks. Right, he's watching me, exactly. I put him and Sylvis Cadwallader, who's a newspaper man, I put their tents next to my tent when we were in camp. I had them set up next to me. Sherman has no part of this. He says, they're all here to tear you down. They're all watching you. My brother's a senator. I can tell you right now, it's a nest of vipers up there. These people are here to do nothing but tear you apart. And I said, let them see everything. I have nothing to hide. Which is what it comes down to. These men see all the operations of the Army. Charles Danner writes back to the president because he told me when he was sending off, I cornered him. And I said, I know why you're here. You resolved that pay problem, if there ever was one, rather quickly. But you're here to check on me because of reports from the president. And he said, I'll be candid with you, yes, because the president's anxious to know if you're drinking because he's considering you for command of all the armies. And he doesn't want to appoint you commander of the armies if you're a drunk. He's already getting enough criticism. Can you imagine how that would look for the president, that he appoints this man who's drinking after he appoints him? So that point is dispelled because Dan says, I wrote back and said, I haven't seen you touch a drop in active command. Well, thank you for that. And I appreciate that he does. He also says then, the president's anxious too, because he's heard from the political party, says there's been rumblings of you replacing him or running against him, so he's anxious to know your politics. And I said, well, I'm a general in the Army. I have no politics in uniform, and I'm in uniform every day. I said, you tell him I have no aspirations on the presidency. And he said, you have got to reconsider that because we've had other successful generals in our nation's history already to this point who've parlayed that success into being presidents. Would you want to do the same? I said, goodness, no. Who would want the job? I said, if anything, because I'm not interested, I was president of the Dialect Society at West Point. We had a book club. This library we have at West Point rivals your own. 3 times over. Books from around the world, some of the greatest authors ever known. And we're not allowed to read the books. Because we're there to study tactics. We're there to memorize Jomini's tactics manual for Napoleon. And there's no time to read books, they tell us. Well, those of us that like books, I've been reading since I was a boy. We had 32 books in our home library in Georgetown. We had the largest library in Brown County owned by a private family. So I sent for books from home. The other cadets, and Winfield Scott Hancock becomes my vice president and secretary of the Dialect Club. And we share books with everybody throughout. So that's the only time I've been elected president of anything. And that was enough. I don't want any part of it from there. And I told Dana that. I said, still, I might want to consider. He says, yeah, I knew there'd be something going on. I said, no, I don't think you understand. If I go back to Galena when the war's over, I want to race horses. I want to start a horse farm. But I said, maybe I'll run for mayor. He said, why in Galena? Do you know anything about Galena? It's a lead mining town, west of Chicago, very close to the border with Iowa. There's a lead mine nearby. That's the whole point of the town being. There's a train station. There's no track lane. It hasn't happened yet. But what they're looking for is bringing the trains through, grabbing the lead, and getting out of there. It's a little, as he says, it's a podunk frontier town. He says, why would you want to waste your celebrity as a general, as the most successful general since Washington? Why would you want to waste that on that little podunk frontier town? And I said, well, there's a railroad station built. There's no track lane. Maybe if I'm mayor, I can see to that getting done, and maybe sidewalks put in so people don't muddy their boots when they're walking down to ride the train. And he laughed. He said, that's the height of your political ambition. I said, yeah, what else would there be? You're serving the people. I've always believed that that's what the president's goal should be. And he just kind of laughed at that. I said, well, I think President Lincoln will be happy to hear that from you. So apparently that's what he wrote back to the president. It's not right after capturing Vicksburg that I made General in Chief. It's not until after lifting the siege at Chattanooga where our troops were tied down. And Lincoln said at that point, that's a whole story for another day as well. But the fact is, Chattanooga was ringed in by General Bragg's Confederate Army on 3 sides, on Raccoon Mountain, Lookout Mountain, and Missionary Ridge. The rail yards were all tied up, so George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was trapped there without supplies. I somehow managed to get in during a sleet storm on horseback with my staff. And within days of getting there, we lift the siege, we start feeding the army, and within a month's time, Bragg's army is crushed and sent packing back into Georgia. So Lincoln said, if Grant can get in there, and by the way, I had fallen with a horse in August that summer leading up to that, and I was still in a cast with a crutch in the carbine sling on the horse I was riding when we got there. So Lincoln said, if Grant can get in there during a sleet storm with a bum leg, I want him to be general in chief. So it comes through, and it's just a quirk of the calendar. It's leap year in '64, so it's February 29th that Lincoln signs off for Congress's approval to reestablish the position of Lieutenant General. And that's when I'm summoned to Washington. So that's what you've been waiting for, is to hear about meeting Lincoln, I would say, and actually hearing about us together. But I wanted to build you up to that so you would know kind of what's in the expectation maybe from Lincoln himself. Now off I go. It's March of '64. I'm summoned to the Capitol. I'm directed that I will report to the President on March 8th for promotion. So March 7th, my son Frederick and I come into town. Everybody else stayed out in Tennessee. And we go into town. We go to the Willard Hotel, which is the biggest, most beautiful, spiky hotel in Washington. Now, Washington, in spite of having dirt streets, has gas lamps all through the town. There's a bit of a cosmopolitan atmosphere. They're trying to look like a European capital, but they do their best. But this Willard Hotel even has a steam-powered elevator. Gas lamps inside. They say some of the rooms, the suites, have hot and cold running water, so that you can bathe right there. You don't have to take buckets and come from the downstairs and fill your tub with water. So, not that I'm going to be looking forward to staying at the Willard Hotel. I'm there to get to see the President and carry out the orders. Well, Fred and I come up to the desk. I'm wearing a uniform. I have a linen duster over top of it. We've been on a train for the last, I guess, cumulative about 17 and a half hours from Tennessee. So we're a little road weary, we're tired, and I come up to the clerk, and he looks at us, he says, how could I possibly help the two of you? Now my boy's wearing a round brimmed, broad brimmed hat. He's wearing a sack coat, which goes down to the pockets. Like I said, I'm covered up with linen. They can't see my rank on there, so we look like farmers probably. And I said, well, we're here to see the President. He snorts and says, well, isn't everybody? Well, I have to see him tomorrow. We need a room tonight. And I didn't say who I was. I'm thinking about who I am to him, just give me my room. And he says, well, for the two of you, all I have left is the garret. The garret's the top floor. And he says, there's one bed. I look over at Freddie. Now, the first home we built, besides paying the slaves that worked for me, the first home I built on that farm, called it hard scrap, because my father-in-law called his spread Whitehaven. He had this glorious plantation name for it. And like he told me about not marrying his daughter and not being a good farmer, he looked at me and said, that house will fall down in a week. Are you even going to give it a name? And I said, yeah, I'm going to call it hard scrabble. Along the point. So hard scrabble was a one-floor house with a loft where we all slept upstairs. So when the clerk tells us there's one bed, I looked over at Freddie, all 13 years of him, and I said, hey Fred, we're gonna share the bed like we used to at hard scrabble. And he just kind of shrugged and said, that's fine with me, Papa. We'll do that. So I signed the book, Ulysses S. Grant and Son, Galena, Illinois. The clerk turns it around to read it, and his eyes got really big. He takes a breath, he kind of sits back, he says, well, Jim Grant, I apologize, I had no idea you were here. There's a note here on the desk, but there was an envelope for me from the President. And he said, the presidential suite's waiting for you, we have it all reserved. And Fred looks up and he goes, well, are we going to stay in the garret? We're going to stay in the presidential suite at this point. So we have one trunk with all our clothing we're going to need. And I didn't realize until later, I forgot the key to open the trunk. And in that trunk is my dress uniform and a set of polished boots and everything I'm going to need to look gussied up to go see the President. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We go over to this elevator, the bellman takes our bag, he opens up this iron door, and Freddie's afraid to get in. He's looking at this whole thing. You can see all around, it's like a cage on a pulley that goes up. And I said, just think about it like it's a vertical train, we'll just ride it up. So it opens up to the 4th floor, to the presidential suite. There's no other doors, there's a hallway in the suite itself, and there are several doors on either side of the hallway. And the bellman drags the trunk out and he says, bedrooms are on either side, and there's a full bathroom at the end that has hot and cold running water. Now, I've never used one myself. Freddie, you can imagine, is even more excited about that. So he goes off to explore, and I hear him opening doors as I'm tipping the bellman. And I hear footsteps on the floor, and then I hear springs. And then I hear, he runs across to the other, and I hear springs on the other side. And I'm standing in the hallway. Boy, what are you doing running around? And he comes out and he says, Papa, there's a bed in this room, and then there's a bed over here. I'll bet there's beds in those rooms too. We can sleep here tonight, so tomorrow night we'll sleep over here. So he's all fixated on the fact we have to stay in the one bed together, because I told him that's how we'd be. But I said, no, boy, you can sleep in any one of those rooms you want. Just don't jump on my bed when we get done. So he's hungry, I'm hungry. I'm not quite sure when I'm supposed to meet the president, other than what that envelope told me that tomorrow, the next day, they say March 8th, you'll report to the executive mansion, and we'll go through ceremony. All right. Well, we'll get some food, we'll see about it. Now, by the time we get downstairs to the restaurant that's in the hotel, I failed to tell you, it's society night in Washington. Can you imagine what society night would be like? A lot of people, and they're all dressed up. A lot of congressmen, a lot of people going after the congressmen for favors, senators are all there. So they're all in their tailcoats and their white ties and gloves, and the ladies are all in gowns with hoops on, and we're in the middle of the war. This is Washington City, and it's society night. And there's an orchestra wheezing and cranking on in the corner, sawing away on violins while people are eating. And I'll tolerate it, because I'm not fond of music, but I'll tolerate that. But we go and sit down. I can't get a bite in my mouth because the whole room starts chanting, Grant, 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 Grant. And I realize that the clerk let it out that I'm there. So I have to keep standing up. They just keep doing it. It's relentless. I'm rescued by a captain. The captain comes in a dress uniform. He's got the gold fringe on his shoulders. He's got his scarlet sash. He's wearing his sword. And he has his hardy hat, similar to my hat, but one side of it's all peaked up. He's got a gold embroidery on the front of it. And he comes over and smartly salutes me. He says, General, it's my pleasure to tell you that the president has invited you to a reception at the executive mansion. All right, tomorrow night. No, sir. He wants you now. I'm trying to eat, but okay, it's the president. So Freddie, pack up your food, go upstairs, jump on beds. I'll see you later. Freddie goes upstairs. I can't get the trunk open, so I'm going to have to go see the president in my traveling uniform. I shrugged off the dust. And we go over to the mansion, and just as much as it's society night at the hotels, it's society night at the executive mansion too. So besides all those men in white ties and tails and ladies in gowns, you have military officers everywhere, just like this captain, all gussied up, fringe everywhere, sashes and swords and spurs. And the difference in music is that the Marine band's all tucked up in a corner in their red coats, redder than your socks, sir. The Marine band. But that's a good scarlet color that their uniforms. So they're in their uniforms, wheezing away, making their noise. And Mrs. Lincoln standing by them, tapping her, clapping her hands and smiling. People are dancing. And when I'm brought to the front of the room, everybody stopped. The Marine band stopped playing. The room parted like this Red Sea for Moses. Lincoln came walking from the back of the room. And I've never seen him before, but I was told, when you see the president walk, don't be shocked. Have you seen Lincoln walk? It was a good thing I was told that ahead of time, because as he came towards me, his arms are behind him when he walks. He swings his arms behind him to keep his balance, and he stretches his legs out in front of him. So he's walking, and he comes towards me. Why, look, it's our General Grant. I've been waiting to see you. As he's come walking up to him. Imagine the tail flapping behind him, white vest, he's got the gloves on. And I'm just standing there looking at this man coming towards him. All I could think about, he looks like a farmer crossing furrows. That's how you walk over plowed fields anyway. But here he is walking like a farmer, dressed up like a pig. But here he is. And he grabs my two hands. He grabs me with two hands. He shakes my hands. He's a good 1.5 taller than me anyway. And he looks at me, he's smiling. He goes, I trust your trip in was wonderful. Have you eaten yet? We got food right over. He's just like he's supposed to be in his home or something. You know, this is home. But he's so folksy about it. There's nothing, no air about him. There's nobody stomping a baton on the floor and declaring who I am. There's none of that pretense going on. It's so homespun from the president. So he walks me to a different corner, and there's a small couch. And he goes, why don't you go stand up on there for a minute, let everybody look at you. So I'm up on this. I thought he would hand out sticks so people could just poke. That's what I felt, because the room just rushed over. And everybody's looking up at me. He said, well, that's our general from the West, everybody. He steps back. He goes back over where he started from, leans up on the fireplace. He's smiling at me. He gives me this chuck with his fist every once in a while. And all these people are all around me, tugging on me. And, you know, they've never seen a dirty general before, maybe, considering they're all gussied up. And he lets me fly in the wind for a good 10 minutes. I don't know how long it was for sure. I didn't dare pull my watch out. But it all gets done. He comes over and goes, "Let me rescue you, General." He takes me down and go into one of the side rooms, and he hands me a piece of paper. And I'm thinking, this is it. I don't have to go through that, because I'm not. It's ironic I'm talking to all of you. It's ironic I'm talking to all of you because I'm not a very public person. I've never liked groups. I've never liked big crowds. When I was given that regiment in Illinois, the general in charge of our brigade went on for almost an hour to talk about the brigade itself and introduce me, to the point I was embarrassed to be standing there because the men were looking pretty beat up, tired from having to stand in the sun. And he said, "I'm now introducing your colonel." And I got up in front of them all and I said, "Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to command you. Turn to your duties." I turned to walk away, and I'll start to cheer. Because they knew I wasn't going to be there to make speeches. When I was 10 years old, I was with my friends at the circus, and I got grabbed by the fortune teller as we were walking by, put me up on a soapbox, and made a big spectacle about reading my bumps on my head to predict my future. You know, my friends gathered, and all the circus people gathered, and I did not like that at all. And he's making a big show of it, messing my hair up. He turns me around like he's looking at my teeth like I'm a new horse or something. And he spins me around. Now this man was all silken, baggy, looked like a genie the way he was dressed with the different colors, and he had earrings. He was carrying a tambourine, and he's fussing with me. And finally he turns me around. He's looking at me. He looks at the crowd. He says, "This boy will be president of the United States one day." And the crowd laughed. And my friends up front, Ulysses is going to be president. So, goodness gracious. So his alarm went off. I had an alarm at West Point in a watch. It was gifted to me by my fellow cadets. And I was in the middle of recitation of the tactics of Jomini, my portion of the class where I had to recite. And they had set the watch to go off in my pocket. They handed it to me before, "Hey Sam, here's your new watch." "Oh great, I'll look at it later." I tucked it in. And I'm up front describing cavalry charge, and all of a sudden this thing starts to chime in my pocket. And I carried on with the lesson. I didn't even look down and regard it. And the lieutenant who was giving the class was looking through his desk to see what was going on. It was chiming in my pocket at the same time. But yeah, you have to carry on in those situations. But here we are, having been embarrassed as a boy, like I just told you, and countless other times like that. Here I am in front of all these people. Lincoln takes me away from that, hands me a piece of paper, and initially I think I'm free of all this. This is all I came for. We can go from here. No. It's a note from him describing the things I should remark on in my speech the following day. I don't have to give a speech. And I'm not really keen on giving a speech. So he hands it to me. I tucked it away, and I said, "Well, I'll have a look at this overnight back at the hotel." "Oh, you got in the hotel, just fine." He knows where I am. But he's acting like it's a miracle that I found a room in Washington along the way. He's incredibly accommodating that way. But I carry all kinds of papers even now that I hand them to a clerk if I don't know what to do with them. But certain things I keep with me. This is a nice reminder to share with you. Now Lincoln's note to me, he said, "There's a few things I want you to address in your remarks tomorrow." One of them was, I would abide his orders as my commander-in-chief. I would show proper respect to the office of president and basically know my place as the general-in-chief. And all I could think when I was reading that was, he's had problems with so many other generals that he has to spell this out how he doesn't want problems with me. So I tucked it away and said, I'll have a look at that. So now the next day comes. Lincoln gets up in front of the cabinet, the reporters who were there, and my boy Fred's off in the corner. And one of the most significant things he says, "I have waited all this time to finally find a general who was willing to take responsibility and lead the armies. And I have that now in General Grant." He turns to me and he says, "If there's anything I can do for you as Commander-in-Chief, is within my power, you need only ask, and I'll do that." Well, those are wonderful words from the President. And he says, "Now, General, do you have anything to say?" I step forward, pull this out, "Thank you." And he looks at my paper. Now, I realize later why this only one piece of paper. He was expecting a lot more. But I said, "Mr. President, I accept this commission with gratitude for the high honor conferred. With the aid of the noble armies that have fought on so many fields for our common country, it will be my earnest endeavor not to disappoint your expectations." So that covers a lot of what he wanted me to say. I said, I feel the full weight of the responsibilities devolving on me, and know that if I am met, it will be due to those armies, and above all, to the favor of that providence which leads both nations and men. Just what I'm doing right now is what I did then. And he's standing here. Is there anything else you have to say? No, sir. That's it. Well, I think, he didn't know what else to say. He expected this long-winded thing about how I was going to obey every word of this. And that may have caused one moment of friction between us, but to me, that's the only one I'm aware of between us, because I needed to establish at that point that if I'm going to be General-in-Chief, I have to be allowed to be General-in-Chief. I can't have him in my vest pocket directing everything I do. And like I said to my staff, and I shared with you, he's never going to come to me and ask me to use the Army because I'm not using it. So I wanted to make him understand that he didn't need to watch over me like a mother hen at the same time. And I think he understood that. Midwesterners, we have a way to communicate sometimes. It's kind of direct and succinct and a little covert, but the understanding was there between us. And the relationship, the friendship flourishes from this point. He whisks me all around Washington for the next 2 days. Carriage rides. You think you promoted me coming here, which is all wonderful and appreciated. It pales in comparison to how Lincoln played me up coming to Washington. Everywhere we went, we had to be together. We were in his carriage together. He was standing up everywhere. This is General Grant. He's with me. He's showing me off to everybody, street corners in Washington. For 2 days. We go to luncheons. We meet congressmen. And I can't remember anybody's name. I don't know what to say to these people because all I'm anxious to do is get back to the Army. So I tell him after 2 days, but I said, respectfully, Mr. President, I'm tired of this theater in Washington. I need to get back out in the field. General Meade's army is holed up outside of Washington at Brandy Station, Virginia, about a good 2-hour train ride away. I said, I really want to go out and meet General Meade while I'm here and talk to him. Oh, well, good. That means you're going to be in Washington a lot more. He thinks I'm going to set up shop in Washington. He's really looking forward to me staying in the Capitol so he can come visit me at the War Department while as he puts it, manage the war. And I said, well, after I go see Meade, I'm going to head back out to Tennessee. Why are you going all the way out there? Well, I got to go transfer command to Sherman and give him directions, and then I'll come back to Washington. But I think I'm going to ride with the Army in Virginia when things get. Why would you want to do that? He says. I said, well, I'm not quite confident. That's why I have to go meet General Meade. Something else he said to me as I'm getting ready to leave for that. He tells me, in the meeting with everybody at the cabinet at the promotion ceremony, off to the side, he says to me, you know, General, I'm anxious to know your strategy, but you have to be careful. You can't tell me everything because I'm liable to go home and tell Molly, and she'll tell all the papers. So, yes.
What's your opinion of me?
Me? Oh, I'll get to him in a second. I'm rather fond of him, actually. But when he says to me, I can't tell him my strategy because he'll tell his wife, but he wants to know it anyway, that's classic Lincoln, where he says one thing but says another in there. And I said, well, I'll tell it to you this way, sir. I haven't worked out the details, but at this point, my plan is for all the armies in the field to engage all the rebels on every front at the same time, so that none of them can render aid on a different front and not be engaged. Now, I did that mainly because what I saw at Chattanooga. When I got to Chattanooga, Bragg's army was all ringing around the Cumberland Army in Chattanooga itself. Lee was not engaged by Meade at that point. This is October, November of '63. So Meade is not fighting Lee. There's still good weather to do that. So because Lee's not engaged, he sends Longstreet's entire corps out to Tennessee to help Bragg. So that's part of the influence of why all these armies have to go at the same time, so nobody has anybody free that they can spare somewhere else. That would be like the whole fight going on here and there's nothing over here, so they start asking for help and you all can go over because no one's over here keeping you busy. It's about the most plainest way to explain that. So Lincoln chews on that a little bit. And he says, yeah, you're fighting that. He goes, well, he looks at the cabinet, he goes, I think I understand it. General Grant's going to hold the leg while someone else skins it. Okay, if you understand it that way, that's good for me, sir. And I got back. By that point, Julia had come into town, and she meets me at the hotel. And she hadn't met the president yet, so she's anxious. So what was it like? How tall is he? And all these questions she has. And she says, what did you talk about? I said, well, I told him the basic strategy, which is that we'll attack all the Rebs all at the same time. What did he say to that? Was he excited? I said, yeah, he understood it. He said that if you can't skin the leg, you'll hold it. And she thought, well, that's rather odd for the president. I said, no, he's going to go home and tell his wife that. And I already knew that about him at that point. You could imagine him sitting down over dinner and Mrs. Lincoln asking him, so what do you and the general talk about? And he'd just be sawing away on the food. He'd say, well, he's going to hold the leg while someone else gets it. Because that is his character to do that. So at some point, I think they had that conversation and confused him. So off I go to see General Meade. General Meade wants to give me all the customs and courtesies appropriate to the General in Chief. So there's a zoo-off band set up at the train station playing their noise. And I already told you I'm not really fond of music, but that's beside the point. He's trying to do the right thing. There's nothing against him for that. He's in his dress uniform to meet me. I'm not. So I come off the train and said, I didn't realize I was coming to a review, George. Thank you, though. And he looks at me because I called him George. Not tilted his head. He's a little informal, aren't we, sir? And I said, you can call me Grant. I won't be offended by that. Already at this point, Lincoln and I, after a few days, we're just referring to each other by our last names. And that continues, no matter who's there. And that's a habit I have with most of my subordinates who are somewhat friends as well. Sherman and I all the time talk to each other. Lincoln and I talk to each other that way quite often. He prefers to use everything else when he wants to sound a little official. So I go meet Meade. We talk down the strategic idea, and we get down to the end of it. Is there anything else, sir? I said, yeah. Before I go back, the president asked me to ask you why you didn't go after Robert E. Lee after the fight at Gettysburg. Do you know George Meade's nickname? Like I said, there's a lot of colorful nicknames. The goggle-eyed snapping turtle. He's goggle-eyed because he wears glasses. Snapping turtle because he has this incredible temper. Short fuse temper. Pretty much as bad as my chief of staff, John Rollins. I like to say that Rollins gets mad for me, that I don't have to. And I see that with me. Now, what I noticed when he was in the dress uniform talking to me, I'm looking him up and down. His sword wasn't a standard ceremonial sword. It must have been his regular sword. The scabbard was kind of dented in a couple places and the hilt's a little tilted one way. And I just thought maybe he didn't have his other sword with him, because I can appreciate not having the right uniform. And in this moment, when I said what Lincoln wanted to know, I understand why that sword is so banged up, because he unhooks it off the belt, throws it on the ground, steps on it. What that sword ever did to him when he kicked it, I don't know. But that he was showing me just how mad he launched that sword off. He goes, you go back and tell the original aide that he directed me to protect the Capitol. And I got this 15-minute tirade from him, which was a lesson in the discussion he had with Lincoln. When he received orders to command the Army of the Potomac, middle of the night, they came to his tent. He had just had an explosive argument with Joe Hooker, who was the Army commander until that moment. That before he went to bed, he was telling Hooker everything he thought of him, throwing his sword, no doubt, every colorful metaphor you can imagine. And when he was woken up in the middle of the night, he thought he was being taken away by the provost marshal for insubordination. And he was handed a letter from Lincoln that said, I've asked you to assume command of the Army, and specifically to guard the Capitol. That's what he said to me, because the letter from Lincoln says to guard the Capitol. He made no mention of Robert E. Lee in this letter. Okay? He's yelling at me like I'm the one who asked him. So I'm just here for the president, so I know better than to ask direct questions than anyone from him. But I understand his position. I understand his passion. I got to give him a lot of credit. He took over that army on the march. Middle of the night, he's given command. His army is spread across 100 square miles. He doesn't have control of half of it. He's still trying to figure out where his own corps has been spread to, let alone the other corps that are in that army that he's now in charge of. So he has to do a lot of improvisation while he's assuming command and hopefully developing a command structure. So I understand all that. And in his 15 minutes, he's explaining all of it. He says, you wouldn't send me out to a baseball game as the catcher and then tell me to manage the game, would you? Well, I don't know that I would. Very good catcher. He didn't appreciate the Jimmy ball, but he's a little upset about all this with Lincoln, but it influences the way I write the orders to his army. Because when every commander's given their orders to march, it's going to be May 4th is a step-off day. May 4th, 64 is when your army will move on the Confederates in your front. And for me, specifically in his letter, I write that wherever Lee's army goes, so shall you. Lee's army is your objective. So there's no ambiguity about that. There's no question of, did I tell you to protect the Capitol? That no, you're going after Lee's army. That's where I want you. And Meade strikes me as the kind of man that's going to follow that. One of the first things he says to me when I step off the train, he says, I know we're going to meet, but I want to let you know right off, I won't be offended if you were leaving. I'm little shocked by that, because I'm thinking, do you want to quit? I don't need you to quit right now, I have plans for you. And he says, well, I would imagine you want to bring your friend Sherman over from the west and take command. He said, because, he says, I have no ego to bruise on this. If what's most important is winning the war, so if you move me to another command, I'll accept it. But I said, that's exactly why you need to stay here. Because you, between last July and now, you've actually developed them in your command. Why would I want to change that now? I have to learn the East on my own, let alone Sherman would have to learn. I've just turned everything over to Sherman in the West. He's got command of it. Why would I drag him away from that and replace him? That's been the problem. The gentleman that was back there left us, he totally supports that with what he said earlier too. The problem's been this lack of coordination. The problem's been all these generals squabbling over who should be in charge and who shouldn't. And here's General Meade saying he's happy to accept whatever I tell him to do. So how could you look down on somebody that's thinking?
He didn't have any problem with you following his army?
Initially, so did he have any problem with me following his army? Initially, no. There are some things that come upon that. What I told him was my headquarters would be in the field about 10 miles from your own. And he says, well, why do you need to be in my area? I said, I'm not commanding your army. You're going to command your army. I said, my command is actually leading the entire U.S. Army. A lot of people don't look at it that they don't understand that because the papers write up, no doubt the history books will write up, that I took command of George B's army. And I ask everybody who says that to me, show me where I've ever written an order to relieve him of command. And I haven't. So he's always in command of that army. Why do I take command of it? Because Congress, in their infinite wisdom, that summer, decided to call General Meade away to tap dance in front of the committee on the topic of the war in Washington, when we're at the front of Petersburg. The same time that we're at the front of Petersburg, laying siege to Lee's army there, General Early has taken a force out of Shenandoah and decided to come across Maryland and attack the capital. So Lincoln, at that point, sends me a note and says, I'd really like you to come to the Capitol and supervise the defense, if you're not doing anything. Not quite that far, but he implies, like, you know, I know you. What he really sets up is, you're just sitting in front of Petersburg. I need you up here. And all I said was, I have duties at Petersburg. That's all I said to him. And he left that alone, which was the incredible unspoken language between us that I didn't have to explain any further. Now, why to explain to you is that Meade is gone. Meade's the Army commander. Meade is gone up in Washington, having his time wasted in front of Congress. The next senior general, if I were to leave, is another two-star general, and it's Ben Butler. You know anything about Butler? What's Butler's nickname? Spoons. Why is his name Spoons? Because when he liberated New Orleans, he went around collecting silver and place settings and everything else from the rich families as punishment. Of course, took a lot of spoons. The women in New Orleans didn't like Ben Butler either. They were dumping chamber pots out their windows on the soldiers. So any woman caught offending any of the soldiers will be arrested and jailed for plying her trade, which was a euphemism for suggesting they might be prostitutes, even if they're not. But all the women in New Orleans were infuriated by that. They started selling chamber pots with Ben Butler's face inside the chamber. Winning hearts and minds all over New Orleans, right? So he's the next general who's senior that would take command if I were to leave that area and go up to Washington. So there was no way that was going to happen. And I knew at some point I would go visit the president that I could explain that. But in the shorthand of it, he understood when I said no, there was a good reason behind it. And he doesn't question it. And I think that's another endearing thing about our friendship, is that I have his trust. Obviously, he has my trust to lead the army because he wouldn't put me in charge without, but I have his as well. That I can talk to him that way, and he doesn't get offended by it. He doesn't ruffle his feathers over it and think that I'm being insubordinate. And I never abuse that either. There's no way I'm going to ever lift an abusive word along the way. So there's an incredible amount of trust between us that goes with that. Now, come down to the siege of Petersburg. We established a headquarters 8 miles east of there at a point of land. The Appomattox Manor is there's a plantation there. And it's called the Appomattox Manor because the Appomattox River comes out and meets the James River before it goes on to Potomac and Chesapeake. So at this confluence of those two rivers, this town of Hopewell and that manor is referred to as Signal Point. When we crossed the James River after the fight at Cold Harbor, we established a headquarters there. It was probably the largest military headquarters and supply base the world has ever seen to that point. There's a mile and a half of riverfront curving around the point that we have built wharves and docks on, with rails for trains built into the docks, because the man who runs the U.S. Army Railroads, Herman Hopp, has designed these barges with rail track on them, that the boxcars are all lined up on these barges, and then the barges are brought in sideways to the dock, where the trains come up through the dock and pull the cars off. So we have this massive, massive supply base right there to supply George Meade's army besieging Lee at Petersburg at the same time. And Lincoln wants to come down and see him. So in the process of all that, this is another thing about Lincoln's character and his integrity. His eldest son, Robert, is away at Harvard studying to be an attorney. Robert wants to join the army. Robert has been reading the papers. Robert has been hearing what people say. All the nation's sons are all fighting the war, and the president's son is safely tucked away at Harvard. He feels really guilty about that. So he wants to go in the army. And he says to the president, if I have to be a private carrying a musket, I'm doing my duty. It's not fair to everybody else. Well, Mrs. Lincoln's having none of that. They lost their youngest son not too long before that, and she can't abide the thought that, by this point, her nickname for me is the Butcher. She doesn't want her son Robert in the ranks of the Butcher's army. So Lincoln comes to me when I'm in Washington. I'm up to see him, and he says to me, you know, Grant, I got a favor to ask of you as a friend. Well, all right, Mr. President, because I can see where this is like the professional level we're on. And he says, no, this isn't General the President. This is Lincoln the Grant, just like we're friends. He says, now, my oldest boy Robert wants to join the army. Molly doesn't want him to go off carrying a musket. I'd like to see him in uniform too, because I think it's a good thing. He says, is there a chance you can find a place on your staff suitable for him? And I'm thinking it over. Well, what are his talents? Well, he's studying law at Harvard. I have 3 attorneys on my staff. John Rollins, my chief of staff, is an attorney. John Bowen, who's an attorney in Missouri, and Nellie Parker, who's a full-blood Seneca chief. Now, he's not a bar-accepted attorney, although he's passed the bar 5 times. He's not allowed to practice law in the United States because he's not a U.S. citizen, although he's a native. Seneca chief. Yeah, pretty interesting there. Now, we met in Galena before the war. We caught up again at Vicksburg. He was with an engineer company. And once I'm made General-in-Chief, I embrace him onto my staff. So I've got these 3 attorneys on my staff anyway. It can't hurt to have Lincoln come in, because he'll have people he can talk to in their lawyer-like language along the way, and he'll be served along the way. Now, Lincoln in all of that says, well, I appreciate you doing that. He says, I'd like to see his rank as an officer. We'll make him a captain. And I'm sure we can fill out the papers and have the quartermaster. He says, no, that's the point. The quartermaster doesn't have to concern themselves. I'll see to all of his pay. So the president makes sure his son is paid, for what he has to do. His uniforms are all from the president's salary himself. He said, I don't want to tax the government anymore for my son. He says, I'll take that on personally. That's some integrity. He could have easily just, he joined up, off he goes. But Lincoln thought that was important to do. And Robert becomes part of the City Point Army family. Staff's in wonderfully. We're sitting around the table together having dinner as a staff. And this is where Lincoln comes back in. Because I looked over at Captain Lincoln and said, hey, Robert, how come your father hasn't been down to visit you? Oh, well, President, my father says you're a busy man. He doesn't want to interrupt you. I looked around the table, and they're all kind of sitting there looking at each other. I said, the President said I'm too busy for him to interrupt me. I said, well, yes, sir, he doesn't want to. Imagine that. The Commander-in-Chief doesn't want to interrupt me. So he won't come visit his own son because he doesn't want to interrupt my work along the way. You got to love the man for that. But I said, you tell your father he's welcome here anytime. So within 2 days, one of the 4 ships that travels between Washington and City Point, he comes down, comes to visit. There's an honor guard set out, there's a band set out, and troops are lined up for him to do a review of the assembled troops that are there. Now, he's going to do that on horseback. So I brought out a horse for him to ride. And at this point, one of my 5 my favorite to ride most of the time is Cincinnati. Cincinnati is my bay, 17 and a half hands tall, beautiful. He's the son of Lexington, who's a champion thoroughbred racer. So I love this horse dearly. He was a gift from a friend in St. Louis. The other horse I bring out, we captured during the campaign to capture Vicksburg off the plantation of Joe Davis. And that horse, yeah, Jeff Davis's brother. That horse, have you read Washington Irving's well, it's Ichabod Crane. So it's
Headless horse.
Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So y'all call it the Headless Horse, but it's the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. You've read that, right? Can you tell me the name of the horseman's horse? Ah, you haven't read it recently then. Daredevil. The black horse with blazing red fire eyes, right? Well, they brought this horse in. It's a chestnut, beautiful stallion. And he's on a rope. They bring him to the headquarters because after they caught him on Joe Davis's plantation, nobody could do anything with him. So they're dragging him into my area where my tent and my shade fly is, and I come walking out trying to soothe this horse. And they dropped the rope off him, and they ran back and yelled, "No, General, don't!" And the horse came right up to me. They all said they thought he was going to grab my beard and bite my face off because he was chomping and kicking everybody around him. He just stopped short and looked at me, and I reached out and started to scratch his cheeks, and he kissed me. And he nuzzled me, and he knocked my hat off, but he's just stomping his one foot, casually standing there. And I'm just admiring this beautiful horse. When he came up, he looked like Daredevil. He just looked mean, and I just knew you gotta calm him down, first thing. But he immediately, like a puppy with me, he's just nuzzling me, he's all around me. And I asked the men, "Where'd you get him?" "The Davis plantation." "Really? Which Davis?" Because I know we're right near both brothers' plantation. They said, "Joe." I said, "Oh, the president's brother? Well, I'm going to name him Jeff Davis because he's captured property for the Army. So I can't just take it because he's government property." So I tell the quartermaster, "Give me a price, I'll pay for him myself." So I bought Jeff Davis from the herd of contraband that was brought in. And that's the horse I had saddled for the president to ride. I thought he'd get a kick out of riding a horse named Jeff Davis. Thing is, Jeff Davis is about 15 hands, maybe 14 and a half. So when Lincoln saddles the horse, his legs almost touch the ground. He's in the stirrups, but you can see him, and his knees are up around his ears, and he looks really awkward. And his tails are, his frock coat is like draped over the back of the horse, and his top hat's kicked back. And he looks like the hayseed people say he is. And I'm looking down at the president. In spite of how tall he is, when I'm on Cincinnati, I'm still looking down at the president. And I looked over. He goes, "All right, Grant, let's go." I said, "No, sir, we need to switch." Now he gets off the horse. Right when I said we're going to switch, he gets off the horse. But as he is, he's saying, "No, Grant, I can't do that. I've heard about you. Love this horse. He is a fine horse." So we switch horses. Even though he said, "No, you keep your horse." He was happy to. He looks magnificent on Cincinnati. And Cincinnati knows it. But I don't know, he must understand. I have the president on my back because I've never seen him stand up so straight. And we go review the troops. Now we get back to our the headquarters area where my cabin is. And I get down and I said, "President, we're going to have a lunch here." He goes, "You don't mind? I'd like to ride some more." So off he goes with Cincinnati. Now that complex where those wharves are, it's a good 2 square miles. We have a bakery, there's an infirmary, there's a prison area for rebel prisoners, there's a hospital, and there's troops camped everywhere, plus the rail yard that's down along the river. And he goes and tours it all. In fact, he goes to the hospital every time he comes to City Point. The first thing he does after he gets on my horse is he goes and rides over to the hospital and visits over there. He makes it a point to visit whatever rebel men are in the hospital first. But every time he comes after that, I greet him at the landing. And he comes off, "Hey, is my horse ready to go?" First thing, I have to have Cincinnati ready for him. And I never see my horse when the president's around. And comes up that we're now to the point in March of '65, late March. Lincoln sends me a note, says, "I'd like to see you and General Sherman if you can find him. Can you bring him up to City Point?" So Sherman manages to come up. He takes a Navy gunboat called Bat. Comes up from North Carolina, comes to City Point. We meet Lincoln, me, Sherman, and Admiral Porter from the Navy. We meet on the River Queen, one of those 4 boats that does the transporting. And we're in the women's salon. Even more crazy because you don't go near the women's salon. There's women's parlors on trains, men don't go to them on the boats either. But he wants us there because he thinks that's the best place we can be to see. Our wives aren't present, no reporters are present, it's just me, the naval officer, Sherman, and the president, the 4 of us. And he says, "We're here because I want to talk to you about the end." And he says, "Sherman, I've been reading reports of where you are, where your army is. I believe you're close to the end." He goes, "I know Grant's got a stranglehold on Lee here in Petersburg, so I think it's going to be over soon. And I want to grab you men and tell you how I want it to come out." All right, I'm all ears. I don't say a word for this whole meeting. And he goes into it. He goes, "I'm going to tell you simply, we're going to let him up easy." I'm sitting here watching reactions, and Sherman looks over at me and he leans forward, and I know Sherman, when he leans forward, he's about to light up something, pyrotechnic. And he clears his throat, and I'm sitting here going, and he says, well, you know, Mr. President, you and I've met before, we've discussed things. You know my record. I'm just a humble graduate of the West Point Military School. I was director of the Louisiana Military Institute at Baton Rouge, and I can't find anywhere in my memory what exactly military term describes let 'em up easy. I could tell you every tactic of Napoleon, every detail of Caractacus' uniform, but I don't know let 'em up easy. Perhaps as Commander-in-Chief you know something I don't. I'm sitting back watching Sherman go, and Sherman looks over at me, kind of nods. Lincoln laughed. He just chuckled, cleared his throat, he leaned forward, his knees are sticking out, his elbows are sticking out, he's sitting, he says, all right, gentlemen, I'll tell it to you this way. Let me ask you something. You ever fight with your brothers when you were children? Sure. Everybody's fought with their brothers. Sisters too. He says the worst kind of fights always happen between families, don't they? Do you agree? He goes, well, that's what's going on in our country right now too. Yeah, that's true. We do refer to it as the brothers' war. He says, so what happens after you're done fighting with your siblings? Well, you usually help them up. He goes, that's right. You may be standing over them, but you reach out and you get them back on your feet. And that's what I want us to do with the Southerners. Okay. Yeah, we just let them talk. And he says, you get them back to their house, you get them back to their homes, you get them back to their towns, you get them back in their shops, and you get them back on their farms. And you get them to be good citizens again. He looks at me and he says, now you might want to reconsider an unconditional surrender because you got that nickname. He goes, but I'm not going to tell you, but I just want you to think about it. He looks at Porter, he says, you keep up that blockade, because that'll keep the Rebs from getting the supplies they might want. He looks at Sherman, he says, I've read a lot of bad things about you in the paper, probably not even true, which is pretty much what Lincoln finds about himself all the time too. But he says, if you got to give them their rifles and go home and shoot crows with to eat, I don't care, just do it. Now Sherman almost takes him literally. That's a whole other story too. But in that moment, he says it's important to get them to be good citizens, not to punish them. And just kind of accept that. Now, almost in unison, Porter and Sherman looked at him and they said, what about the rebel government? What do we do with Jeff Davis? Well, here's Lincoln kind of looks at that and he says, well, let me tell it to you this way. Now, I know from being in cabinet meetings, when Lincoln says, let me tell it to you this way, you sit down because you're going to get a story. And here he goes with this story. He says, I remember an old teetotaler that went to the county fair back home. And he walked up to the lemonade man and he said, can I get a cup of your lemonade? And the man says, yeah, it'll be a penny. He goes, well, is that all you're going to put in there? And the lemonade man says, well, hold on, I can put a touch of whiskey in there for you. Temperance man looks back and forth and says, you know, if I don't know what's in there, I suppose that'll be all right. That was his reply to what do we do with the Confederate president. And I looked at Sherman, because I could see Sherman already, so we should give him whiskey. I could just hear Sherman say it. But Sherman kind of took my cue and just kind of nodded. So the president, without saying so, just let them go. You know, if I don't know that they're gone, that's probably better, was more or less what he said. So if you don't know Lincoln, you don't know how to interpret that right away, but I've been around him enough where I understand it. So directly treat the rebels as brothers and don't punish them. And as far as their government goes, they're not going to have any strength, any kind of power or control if we ignore that aspect of it, and they'll just kind of wither on the vine. And he's got a lot of wisdom behind that, because if we're going to bring the country back together, it's got the reconciliation has to come. 2 or 3 days later, the end of March, getting ready to head out towards Petersburg. We're 8 miles away. Now, what's my custom in Tennessee? I've done the same thing with this 8-mile stretch of railroad between Oakwell and the front. I've got a 3-car train that I travel with. First car is a boxcar of supplies. The second car made up like a corral for at least 2 of my horses, and the last car is a coach that I use as my rolling office. Well, Lincoln's with me at the depot, and we're watching my groomsmen walk up Cincinnati first onto the car. He starts grabbing Jeff Davis to take him up on the car too. Lincoln's standing with me at the dock, hands behind his back. You're heading out to Petersburg? You know, I'm just watching. Yes, sir. He says, oh, is that Cincinnati or one of your other horses over there? I said, well, I'm taking Cincinnati and Jeff Davis in case one throws a shoe. I'll have the second horse. And he says, he looks away. They're all over here. He looks away. He says, well, I was really looking forward to another ride before I went back to Washington. Hey, groomsman. Old Ben's my groomsman. I said, get Cincinnati off. No, Grant, don't you do that. He's your horse. You're going to need him, he tells me. But I'm taking the reins as he walks away. So, Lincoln is content. He's going to stay at Washington for a few more days. I'm going to the front. April 2nd, a day later, we break through the line at Petersburg. The 6th Corps under Wright, General Wright punches through it at the Banks Farm. General A.P. Hill is killed at that front. Lee's army starts to disintegrate. The whole front of Petersburg collapses. Richmond is wide open at that point. We don't know exactly yet that they sent a message up to the capital and said, we can't guard you anymore, you're on your own. So Lee's army just kind of dissolves and starts heading away from us west through the Piedmont towards Danville, where we're expecting them to go. Danville's a railroad junction where they can get supplies and go down into North Carolina and link up with the rebel army there under Joe Johnston. That's the thought we have at the moment. But it almost becomes a foot race to go after them. So the army's doing their thing. I go into Petersburg proper. Captain Lincoln's with me. And we go up to this house owned by a man named Wallace. We sit down on his porch. He pops his head out the door. And he says, you're not going to burn my house, are you? I didn't even look at him. I said, it's brick, isn't it? Just let him go. He went back in the house. And I look over at Lincoln. I said, hey, Robert, I don't know that your father knows where we are. There's a train station a block over from where we are. Sam Beckwith, my telegraph operator, is with us. I said, why don't you and Beckwith go down to the railroad station here and send a wire back to City Point, let the president know. Oh, yes, sir. So off Lincoln goes with the telegraph man. They're gone for over an hour. It doesn't take long to write a telegraph and send it, and they're only a block away. But within an hour's time, I see this carriage coming towards me. And I see an officer on the buckboard, and I see a man in a black suit and a top hat next to him. And then I see a black horse tied to the back of the carriage as they're coming up. And I stood up because the first thing I thought was, why is my horse tied onto the back of the carriage? So it's Cincinnati, it's on the back of his carriage. It's Captain Lincoln and his father on the buckboard. When they got the word to Lincoln, he was just saddling Cincinnati up to go on a ride. And when they said that Grant broke through at Petersburg, he's in town, he just started galloping out. Went off on a full charge, and they had to get cavalry to run after him and catch him. He got about 2 miles out from City Point, so he had another 6 miles to go through open country where we weren't sure what was in there. So cavalry caught him. They stopped in there. Robert commandeered a wagon along the way and went back and got him, and then they brought him up. So Lincoln and I sat on Wallace's porch and smoked cigars for another hour, and we talked. You probably didn't know Lincoln smoked cigars. Maybe it's because he was with me, maybe not, but he happily accepted one. We had a good smoke together. And he invited me to come up to Richmond with him. He said, I'm going to head up to Richmond from here. Why don't you come with me? And I said, that's for you to do. You're the president. You can make that symbolism. I need to go out to lead the other way. He said, oh, that's why I like you. You're practical. He just left it at that. So up he went to Richmond. And I'm told when he got to the Confederate White House, where Jeff Davis's office was, he walked in, the building was empty. He had colored troops as escorts at the house. The colored troops stood guard outside the house, and he went up and sat at Jeff Davis's desk in that house. So good for Lincoln that got to do that. The rest of the story goes that we chased Lee down. That's a story for another day as well. By April 9th, Lee surrenders. My first message back to Washington was that we went to the Quartermaster General and told him to stop buying supplies. And then the second message went to the War Department. Said, let the president know that Lee surrendered. I will return to brief you. And I was expecting a good 3 or 4 day ride from Appomattox Courthouse back to Petersburg. But the railroad that was in between was a 5-foot gauge railroad. And there was a regiment from Burnside's Corps that was moving one of the rails over to make it standard gauge. So the Army Railroad got to use it. So that allowed me an extra day to meet with Lee, which was an extra bonus to everything else. Because in the meeting with Lee, we discussed terms. I tracked him for 3 days with letters to finally get him to come in. And he asked me in the first letter between us if I had any idea on terms. And in the terms I gave him, it seemed pretty reasonable. I didn't write Lincoln said to let you up easy, but I wrote terms out for him that after 3 days he was willing to accept that. And when we sat down and I wrote it out formally, Lee points out to me in the terms I gave him where his officers could keep their personal weapons and their baggage, and his men could take their personal belongings, but all Army property, horses, artillery pieces, everything was left as captured property. He said to me, you make no provision in here for the animals. And I said, well, they're captured because they were Army property. They're Army property of us now, which we captured. And he said, no, you said that the men could keep their personal belongings. Those men own those horses. Those men own those horses out there. Now, what I thought was, going up the steps into McLean's house, two of his men were holding horses outside. One of them had a U.S. brand on the hindquarter. And he just told me that those men brought the horses from home. And my first thought was, you mean to tell me somebody branded U.S. on a horse? No. But what struck me when he said that, remember I told you there was nobody else in that boat but me, Lincoln, Porter, and Sherman, right? No reporters, no family, and none of us talked to anybody afterward. Yet right here is Lee pointing out that his men needed those horses. And what did Lincoln tell us? Get them back on their farms, right? Get them back on their farms. So in that moment, it struck me when Lee brought that up. Both these men understand. Both these men understand the humanity we're dealing with right here. We're not dealing with professional armies that have been trained for years to go wreck and destroy. We're dealing with citizens who fought for a cause, who are about to become citizens again. That's why Lincoln stresses so hard about getting them home. Get them out of uniform. Get that whole idea of the military out of their minds. Get them back to thinking about being citizens. And they're going to need those horses to do that. So all I could really say to Lee in that moment was that, well, I imagine most of your men are small farmers. They probably have 20-acre spreads at home. They're going to need those horses. It's April. It's planting season in Virginia at that point. And it really, really struck me that Lee himself and Lincoln understood that. So that next day, when I was told that there was a railroad connection that I could use, I knew right away, I have a 6-hour train ride instead of a 3-day horse ride. I might want to stay here. So I asked across the truce line if Lee would meet me the next day. He agreed to. We sat under a tree on our horses together. And besides comparing notes on everybody and breaking it to him that I was riding a horse named Jeff Davis, an awkward conversation itself, I stressed to him that maybe because of his stature within the Confederate government and the Army itself, that maybe he should go be their representative and talk to Lincoln. And he kind of chewed on his lip for a moment. He said, you know, I remember signing a document yesterday declaring that the Army's been surrendered to you. He said, I'm a private citizen of Virginia now. I no longer represent what's left of the Confederate government, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to meet with the president. Actually, he said, your president. Still in that mindset, right? But he's stressing to me he's a citizen of Virginia. He's no longer a Confederate officer at that point. So he was tactful and polite about declining meeting with the president. And I pushed a little further because I mentioned that Lincoln always spoke highly of you to me. He remarked to me that he had asked you to lead his army at the start of the war. And he said, no, I couldn't abide that because he brought troops into my home state, so I don't think I should meet with him. So that ends any idea of bringing Lincoln and Lee together for any kind of meeting. But when I get back to Washington, you can imagine the excitement. There's celebrations everywhere. The carriage tour starts up again, where Lincoln takes me all around. There are torchlight assemblies on almost every corner we have to stop, and Lincoln stands up in the carriage and talks, and I'm sitting next to him, just abiding with the attention. We get back to the mansion, and the Marine band's lined up there, and he goes up. We go up on the second floor, we come out on the portico, and the band's there, and there's people with torches all cheering for everything, and he's showing me off. This is the victor of Vicksburg and of Appomattox Courthouse. So I'm embarrassed to be standing there again. And he goes into a little speech, and he asks the band to play Dixie. He looks down at the Marine band, and he says, I'd like you to favor us with a good air. Of course, the band leader looked up at him. He said, I've always been fond of Dixie. And he says, now that Lee surrendered, I think it's ours again. And I know as a lawyer that possession is 9/10 of the law. So if it's ours again, I'd like to hear it. He's incredible that way. And the band played Dixie. And Lincoln stood there and clapped along and had everybody cheering for Dixie when a day before it was being used as an anthem of the rebellion. And here he is influencing everybody at that point to reach back and embrace each other again. So that the loss of him that comes, and this is the final part of my discussion with him today. I'm surprised nobody asked me from the beginning why I wasn't with Lincoln at the theater. Have you been thinking about that?
Somebody wasn't feeling well, so I thought it was because your wife didn't like it very publicly.
You thought because my wife and his wife didn't get along. Yeah. I led you right into that, yeah. As I like to say about the negative reports that come out about me, or even Lincoln himself, I like to say that that's probably something you read in a Democrat newspaper. And I'll tell you what, because that kind of news sells papers. Hopefully in your time that kind of scandal is ignored. But Mrs. Lincoln doesn't like Mrs. Grant any more or any less than any other general's wife. She had an episode with General Ord's wife at City Point. I told you how Lincoln comes off the boat, the troops are always lined up, he has a little review and all that. Well, there's one of those reviews, and General Ord was going to be the presiding officer with the president, so Mrs. Ord was there, and she was on a horse. Mrs. Lincoln and Mrs. Grant were in a carriage being brought up to the field with two of my staff officers, because Mrs. Lincoln doesn't ride. And she thought, how unladylike, and she's saying this to my wife, how unladylike that a wife of a general would actually ride a horse. Well, I'll bet she'll even put her feet in the stirrups. And she's yelling at her. What she doesn't know, the day that I met Julia, she rode in from St. Louis after finishing school, in the saddle, not side saddle like a lady. 17 years old, just out of finishing school. I thought they'd be bringing her out in a carriage. She's galloping down the road. She vaulted Gravewalk Creek before it come up to the house. She and the horse vaulted the turnstile leading up to the front porch of the home, in the stirrups. That was my wife when I met her, so you ever wonder what I saw in Julia? Now you know. Now here's Mrs. Lincoln saying such a thing to my wife. I can't believe a lady would dare do such a thing. But to her credit, Mrs. Ord is sizeable. She's on this horse, and she comes up next to Lincoln on a horse. And his carriage with our wives is coming up to them. Mrs. Lincoln stands up in the carriage, almost falls out, because she's not holding on to anything. Hand on her hip, "Get that harlot away from my husband!" And she's yelling. Now there's a brass band. There's like a 10-piece brass band set up next to all the soldiers. And they're honking through maybe they're playing Battle Hymn of the Republic, whatever they're playing. She's heard over the band yelling about this harlot next to the president. So Mrs. Grant's sitting a little bit kind of flushed by the whole thing. But I did stress that Mrs. Grant is a society girl, so she doesn't make a lot of fuss about it. She tells me about it quietly later, and she doesn't react to it the way you might think. She just kind of takes it in stride like a lady. Now, comes down to this night we're supposed to go to Ford's Opera House. It's been in all the papers that Laura Keene, world-renowned actress, will be presenting her role as our American Cousin for the 1,000th time, which is quite a significant thing. Have you seen Our American Cousin? It runs for 3 hours. It's been running since 1858. People still come see it. It's a 3-hour play. There are 2 intermissions to get you through it. And it's funny. It's quite funny in a lot of places. A lot of good humor in it. And Laura Keene's the most well-known actress to play the lead role. So with her 1,000th performance in the Capitol, it's known that the President and General-in-Chief will be accompanying each other to watch this. So Laura Keene decided that would be the night that she would donate all the proceeds from the play to soldier relief as well. She knew it was going to be a packed house. So it's a big to-do in Washington. It's a Thursday night. So it's not that busy a thing, but all of a sudden it's a great thing because the President and the General will be there together, and it's in all the papers. And Lincoln says to me that morning, as I'm leaving a meeting with him in the cabinet, he says, "We're looking forward to you tonight, seeing you and Mrs. Grant with us, and we'll meet you there about 6 o'clock," he says. I said, "All right, we'll look forward to that too." Now, I went back over to the Willard Hotel where we were set up to go get prepared, and Julia wouldn't talk to me. I was wondering what was wrong. She kind of avoided me finally, and because I said, "Lincoln's excited about tonight." That's very nice. It's in all the papers. I'm trying to get her a little excited about it. Finally, I sit her down and said, "What's wrong?" She says, "You haven't seen the children in a number of weeks." She's got a good point. I've been out running leading right? And she says, "They're over in Burlington with my sister. Could we go see them? We have a home over in Burlington." And we're there because Freddie was with me in Mississippi, and Freddie was with me in Virginia, and had bullet holes that Cody was wearing. So Julia said, "I want the children away from the war." And that's a story for another day too. But the family's holed up at our home in Burlington on Blue Street, and she says, "We need to go home and see them. Is there any chance we can avoid the theater tonight?" Well, it is a pretty big to do. It's in all the papers. Maybe you've read about it. And she says, "It would really mean a lot to me, and I think you need to see the children." Now, I was asked in an interview one time, the newspaper man asked me what my weaknesses are. I said, "I think I have 2. And I thought he meant personally. He was looking for military weaknesses. And I said, "I think I have 2. "Oh, what are they?" I said, "I think my horses and my children are my weaknesses." And I was deliberate, deadpan about it. And that's the way it was written up. So here's Julia telling me we need to go home and see the children. So I go back over to the mansion, I go see the president, and I tell him, Mrs. Grant suggests we go home and see the children. Is there any way we can postpone going to the theater? And Lincoln says to me, when's the last time you said you've seen your boys? Oh, it's been a number of weeks since you and I sat out with Sherman on the boat. Put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, you go home and see your little ones. He says, you and I have got the next 4 years to go to the theater now that they re-elected me. Those are the last words between us. He sent me home. So I get back to the Willard. We don't know anything about what's going to happen. How could you know any of that? We load up. I'm driving the carriage down to the B&O train station. Mr. Garrett, the president of the B&O, has given us his parlor car to use to ride home to New Jersey. Most of the trip is on the B&O Railroad to Philadelphia. Then we got to take a barge across to Camden and Amboy and come up to Burlington to Philadelphia. So we're on our way. I'm driving our carriage, and this man on a horse comes riding up alongside us. Frock coat, broad brim, flat black hat. He's got a really, really impressive mustache and a small chin beard, chiseled cheeks. Kind of man who should be an actor, striking look on him. He rides up alongside us, and I'm looking at him. He's getting closer to the carriage, and I'm looking at him. And he gets out of the stirrups, and he leans in, and he sneers at me, grits his teeth at me. So I just pushed the carriage towards him and kind of shoo him away. And off he went. You might think it was Boo. In that moment, we had no idea. Because I don't know what Boo looks like. Who knows? Until I see later photo of him. But so somebody tried to kind of run us off the road. We get to the train station, and there's newsboys selling extra, Mrs. Lincoln had a fight kind of stuff. Argument between the president's wife and the general's wife. All these kinds of headlines are already selling papers that we're not going. So that quickly it gets out in the papers after I talked to the president that afternoon that they released it as news. Now, on the train ride, when we get to crossing the Susquehanna River at Havre de Grace in Maryland, if they ever build a train bridge there, that would make it so much easier. For now, there's a barge that the train cars are loaded on and then floated across to the other side. So we have to wait for all that to happen. And as we're on the car or on the barge getting tied down, somebody's at the back door of the car jiggling the handle. And my officers ran out the front, because I had about half a dozen officers coming along. My telegraph man, my chief of staff, and a few others came with us. And they fan out from the front and come back around the back of the car, nobody's there. And we don't really think anything of it. It could have been dock workers, it could have been railroad men, who knows who it was on the back of the car. And off we go. We get up to Philadelphia, and it's near to midnight. We stop at the Bloodgate Hotel, which is the only hotel serving a late supper. And we're told that we'll have to wait for the barge after midnight to get across. All right, well, we'll have supper in here. So we're having supper, and I'm in uniform. Mrs. Grant's in her traveling clothes, and a man from the hotel comes walking up to us. He asks who I am, which is kind of funny. I'm the only 3-star general. But he comes over and goes, excuse me, are you General Grant? Most people don't know what I look like to even relate that, so I guess I was lucky that way, that I won't be bothered so much there. But this man hands me a telegraph, and I kept this one too. I open it up. It says April 14th, 1865, received at 11:45 p.m. It's addressed to me, Lieutenant General Grant. And it follows. The president was assassinated at Ford Theater at 10:30 tonight and cannot live. Now, I read this to myself. I didn't read it aloud. It goes on. The wound was a pistol shot through the head. Secretary Seward and his son Frederick were also assassinated at their residence and are in a dangerous condition. The Secretary of War desires that you return to Washington immediately. I read that to myself. Julia says right off there was something wrong. So she said, what is that about? Let me see. And I said, you have to promise me you're not going to make a sound when I show you this. Slid it across the table. She read it. She gasped. She did this little, trying to keep her quiet. We're the only 2 people in that room. We're the only 2 people outside of Washington City that know at that point. I can't let that just go, because that'll start, who knows what kind of pandemonium that might start. So she says, you have to go back. You got to go. The secretary needs you. You should be there. And I said, what about our children? Secretary Seward, Secretary of State, his son's name is? Frederick. My oldest son's name is? Frederick. So that rung a bell for me. That if his son was attacked, what about my son? So I said, I'm going to go home first. I'm coming with you to make sure you're going to be safe at home. I can't just leave you and go back down there because who knows what will happen. So we got home. maybe 2 in the morning, the children were nestled all snug in their beds, as the story goes. Everybody's peaceable in our home. I left half my staff there. I had my telegraph man, Beckwith, already write up a telegraph. I said, when we get down to the station, because our home is about 2 city blocks from the train station, so we're really close. I said, I sent him off. I said, go back down there. I'd written up something for him to send. And it was put out as a broadcast to military officers, especially in Virginia, because at that point in Virginia, with the rebel army dissolved and being sent home, I had a military supervisor governing Richmond itself, and it was General Ord. So I sent to General Ord and said that the president's been attacked, round up every rebel officer, rebel general officer, and every surgeon for questioning. By the time we got across the river back to Philadelphia, I already had a telegraph back from him. And it said, I'm in Richmond, because we just send a telegraph out not knowing where they are, and he got it in Richmond. So his reply to me was, General, I'm in Richmond. If you'd like, I will round up all the officers, including General Lee and his sons who are here, and we can start the war over. What do you put in the telegraph? And I looked at that and I thought, okay, before we leave, send back to him, everybody disregard my last message as to rounding up the rebels. Act on your best discretion, is all I can think to say. This has never happened to us before. We've never had a president attacked, let alone possibly dead. And at this point where the war is nearly over, the fighting in Virginia is over for certain because Lee has surrendered. But Sherman is still poised to give a knockout blow on Joe Johnston in North Carolina. They're still fighting in Tennessee and Florida and Texas. So it's not over yet. So we don't know what's going on here, if there's a coordinated thing against the government. If the president's been attacked, the Secretary of State's been attacked, we don't know. But I just, at that point, not knowing what else to do, I kind of went a little crazy for a second. And General Ord, it was like a glass of ice water thrown in my face to kind of snap me out of it, to kind of bring me back to reality, and leave him decide on his own. Now I get back into the Capitol about 5:30 in the morning. I'm not allowed in the home because they dragged Lincoln out from the theater, went across the street to a home, and it's all barricaded. There are police around, there are soldiers around, and I came up to them. My chief of staff, Rollins, is with me, and we come up and, where's the president? He's in that house over there. So I go through the barrier, and hands come up on me. John Rollins gets a hold of us. Don't you touch the general. This is General Grant. Don't you know who this is? And the guy looked at him and says, he don't look like his picture. He ain't getting in the house. Whoever it was standing there. So I wasn't allowed to get up in, and Rollins was furious. He was fired up. And I just stopped and I said, we'll go back to you. We'll wait in my office in the War Department and we'll just see what happens. Now, word comes in the 7 o'clock hour that Lincoln passes it. And I never got to go in and see him or anything like that. In fact, one of the men outside said, I ain't let no one in, not even his wife. Find out later she was in there. That just tells you, that just kind of adds to the confusion that was going on in that crazy moment. But no, we didn't not go with them because of the fight. We didn't go because, as Julia revealed to me a few days later, when she came back down to the Capitol and we were talking about it, she said, I'm not surprised this is what happened because I had a premonition. And what did I say to all of you when I started about premonitions, right? Right? Maybe it's my own fault that she held back, because stupid husband trick that I pulled when she said that I had a premonition, I have always refused to listen to her premonitions since courting days, right? Every time she brings one up, I'll just play, oh, stop with that. What did I say when she said that to me? Why didn't you tell me? What was I thinking? Because all 5'2" of her exploded and she stomped her foot. She said, you never listened to me. Why would I try then? Incredibly frustrated by it. She had a good point. I said, so that you could have told me. She says, I didn't know how else to tell you, other than I knew if I got you not to go, you wouldn't be in danger, because the premonition was that the president and I both would be in danger. Yeah. So that's why she came up with, you need to go home and see your children. And I knew it was like, oh, you remember that interview. Yeah, your weaknesses are your horses and your children, remember? Okay, boy, she had a right to be mad at me, for sure. But who would know in that moment if she was trying to give me the clue about her premonition? But we were talking more about it, and she said, have you seen the paper? Have you seen who they've listed? Yeah, Booth, the actor. And we both talked about it. She says, kind of sounds like a man that rode where the horse next to us coming from the train station. But we don't know. We'll never be able to know, because the troopers that caught him shot. and didn't find out. A day or two later, so now we're 5 days past Lincoln's assassination, I got a letter sent to me at the War Department. Anonymous letter, no return address, no signature on it. It was one page, I opened it up, and the man said, "General, I'm relieved to find you alive. I was sent to kill you the night the president was assassinated." Now, it took me a month to reveal that to Julia, because I couldn't bear her exploding about that one either. But when we talked about that, who knows what the possibility there was. We did have the back door of the car chip at that moment. No, I don't travel with Lincoln's funeral train. There were things I had to do in the Capitol because, as I said, the war was still going on at that point. But when his body lied and stayed at in the rotunda of the Capitol, I was right there the whole time. And I'm not ashamed to say how I cried openly. Just couldn't stop. Just looking over at him and realizing what had happened and our friendship that we had developed, everything that was important and everything he represented. One last note about all of that. You've heard of Richard Ewell?
Yeah.
Richard Ewell is one of the subordinate generals from Robert E. Lee. He was with me at the Jefferson Barracks in '46 before I went to Mexico. So I've known Dick since then. And when Lee surrendered, his general officer said, "We as a body will remain in custody until all our men are paroled," sent home. So all the general officers from the Army of the Potomac were sequestered at Warren Island in Boston Harbor. So I got this package from Fort Warren, Boston Harbor, and Dick Ewell's name was on the top. There's a personal note. It said, "Sam, my condolences on what's happened to the country. There's a note further you should read." So there was this full-page letter from Dick Ewell stating that all the Confederate officers that they spoke to and all the general officers signed below concur that this was the worst possible fate for the Republic, to lose the president. Especially because, as they put it, he would have proven himself a friend of the South. And it was signed, like the Declaration is signed, by all these general officers from the Army of Northern Virginia. So the Army's not involved in it. Secretary Stanton, Secretary of War, he presided over the investigation. He was adamant that the Army was involved. This was a coordinated thing for the Army to go after, and then it was going to cause an attack somewhere else, and I had to calm him down from that. When he investigated, he took the cast from the play and ordered them to run the play top to bottom. And he sat there and watched, because he was looking for clues within the dialogue that would have triggered what Booth did. And they ran it one time, and he said, "All right, do it again." They just did it for 3 hours. Right? He says, "Do it again." They did it a second time. "Do it again." He made him do it 3 times in a row. And what he came up with was, in the portion of the dialogue where the shot happened, was the biggest laugh line of the play. There's this old character, this old woman character, trying to marry off her daughter into a rich family. And there's another character that calls everybody out for what they are, which is probably Lincoln's favorite character, because he's a Midwesterner and so is Rat. And he calls her a sock-dologizing old man trap. And when he calls her that, it's the biggest laugh line of the show. And it's at that point when the crowd was roaring with laughter that Booth stood up and took a shot. So Stanton got that figured from the dialogue itself, because he said, "When did it happen in the play?" So, okay, show me that scene. All right, now go back and run the whole thing. So Stanton was weirding his people out to get to the point. But that was the best they could come up with for when it happened. And still, all the actors were under suspicion that they were colluding with Booth. That they, he thinks they told him, "When we say this line." Now Booth knows, because Booth is so well known in Washington and at Ford's. He gets mail at the theater, so he comes and goes whenever he wants. So he's seen that play. We all know the best lines in that play. In fact, when I saw it with Sherman in Tennessee, in our time we yell at the players. You're expected to heckle from the house. And I would whisper things to Sherman, and he would yell up at the stage and say those things all the time. I wouldn't do it myself. But we know from seeing that show a number of times that is the biggest line. Here it comes. Yeah, I know Sherman. He gets ready. But it took Stanton to run it 3 times to figure all that out. And of course, with Booth, he's trapped in a barn. The troopers there overzealously shoot him instead of bringing him in for questioning, and the thing all goes from there. I've been asked too why I didn't do more about that. Well, it's not an Army matter. As General in Chief, I'm in charge of supervising the Army itself, and we put the whole Army's muscle into going after Booth and finish fighting the war. So I'm peripherally following it off to the side, but it's outside of my jurisdiction, particularly because Secretary of War takes it over. So thus ends the tale there, and you have been incredibly patient to sit here all this time. Yes, sir. during the war, where a train I was riding on, the track was sabotaged ahead of us. And I told the men both times, don't report this, because I don't want another person trying to figure out how to this thing. But I haven't received any other threats against me. I ride the streetcars, I walk the streets in Washington. Even in the South. Here's a curious fun thing for you. My father moved from Ohio to come into Kentucky during the war. Early days in Missouri. They're not far from each other. My fathers are parents on either side. The hair plague, I don't think about that. Yeah, yes, sir.
Is it true that you were friends with Longstreet, right?
Yeah, Longstreet was in my wedding party. He stood up with me. He says to people, I may not have been the best man, but I was the best man there. What he likes to say about it.
Oh, yeah, his cousin?
Second cousin by marriage, yeah. On the Bog side of the family. In fact, it's his uncle that fired me for being a Red Cross. Yeah. Pete was a year ahead of me.
One more question. Why did you pick Joshua Chamberlain, except the surrender right after that?
Why did I pick Chamberlain? Because how he carried himself at Petersburg. He was wounded at Petersburg when his regiment was going in. He was shot in the leg. And immediately around him, they knew that. They were trying to get him to sit down so he wouldn't bleed out. He used his sword and propped it up behind him to hold himself up. Because he said, I need to stand. My men need to see me standing throughout the fight. So when I heard about that, his is the only field commission in general that I issued in the entirety of the war.
Yeah, we spoke about the West Point. Is he the epitome of like
He's not a West Pointer.
citizen general?
Yeah, Chamberlain, very smart man. He's a professor at Bowdoin College. And just how he carried himself was most impressive to me, that kind of valor needed to be rewarded. And I think I picked the best man for the job. Because when the surrender came and the rebels marched out in front and stacked arms, Chamberlain ordered our troops to go to present arms and salute them. And then the Confederate General Gordon, excellent horseman, in the saddle, he brings his sword out, returns the salute, and he pulled his horse back, and he and the horse bowed to Chamberlain at the same time. But Chamberlain wasn't told he had to do that. Chamberlain thought in the moment he should, for a gesture of reconciliation. So that was impressive to me that he did. So I think I picked the right one. Yes?
I know that they killed Booth, but did anything come out? I mean, who Booth was and why his...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Booth is an actor in town. He's a rebel sympathizer. The military, we refer to him, someone like him, as a chicken hawk. Because he's all about the fight. You know, and we say if you're willing, if you're so strongly urged about the fight, pick up a musket and join him. But he never would. So he was furious with Lincoln. He had written a lot of things about him. He had gotten in with some other folks, the Surratt family, some others, and plotted everything to go after Lincoln. So with the investigations, they're finding out it's a larger conspiracy, but he's at the center of it. Yeah.
So,
Yes, sir.
So what I find fascinating is and you allude to it several times in the book, is the relationship, or at least the knowledge of people on West Pointers on both sides.
Yes.
And how did that
We spent a lot of time together.
Yeah. How did that play out in your carrying your operation?
It depends on the individual. You know, if you serve directly with somebody, you come to know their attitudes. Like you work with somebody, and if you're pitted against them, if you can rely on them, their personality remaining the same, then you have a base to go. That was frustrating for a lot of my counterparts across the field, because they expected me to also do the same things that the book taught us. They found it frustrating when I wouldn't. And I found it convenient that they would, so I could predict somewhat what they were going to do in a lot of cases. When Pillow skedaddled from Fort Donaldson, the newspapers asked me the next day, do you regret not capturing General Pillow? And I already told you about my impressions of him. And I said to the papers, no, they can keep him for the rest of the war. I was fine with that. Commander like that, you know his shortcomings. So keep him over there. He's doing a great job for us by him being out there like that. I don't have one Confederate commander I come up against, one adversary that I find more challenging than another. A lot of people will pump Lee up and put him on a pedestal. And some will refer to him as the greatest general. And I ask them, how many armies did he capture? Did he win? In the end, did he win? Before that, the way he was in the old army, we all respected him. We all admired him for his family heritage. He's the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, who led Washington's cavalry in the Revolution. So that was something we talked about the first day after meeting him, was when I shook his hand. I was shaking the hand of a man that shook the hand that shook George Washington. One generation removed from a hand that actually touched George Washington when I shook his hand. And that was something in his family heritage that we all admired. He had been superintendent at West Point starting the year that I left the Army. He was up there at 54 through the time. So he's the epitome of the American soldier, for bearing and virtue and everything else. But then when he defiles his oath to the flag, that turns it all down. And I've been asked about that. What about your friends in the rebel army? How do you feel about them? I said, well, if they're willing to take the loyalty oath, I'll accept them as friends. But until they do, they're insurrectionists against the flag because they're taking up arms against the government. And that defiles that oath to the Constitution right there. Where we can talk for hours about my friends on the other side. Maybe another time I get a chance to do that. Yeah.
Where did your authentic mindset come from? With the attacks being so different from the
Well, maybe from what I've seen not work in other times. Because the way I've been asked to state it, and I think the clearest way to state it is you have to hit the enemy hard, fast, and keep moving. And if you don't, you don't.
Is that in your West Point training?
No, that's not in any of the training we get. You know, the training we get is the Field Marshal Jomini was the man who wrote Napoleon's manual. This is always referred to as Napoleonic tactics, right? Napoleon didn't sit down and write those all out. He had a field marshal that he followed. And we have to recite that manual throughout the 4 years we're there. So we're all given a chapter as a class, and then paragraphs are broken down for each of us in the room to memorize, because the next day we come in and recite those paragraphs. But the problem there is, after you've recited that paragraph about what to do with cavalry when you're being flanked, there's no exposition as to why a certain thing is done and why something else is not a good idea. None of that's explained to us. And the theory there is, you just have to know all this, because out there, somebody will teach you. Because there'll be senior officers that will know. There'll be senior officers. Now, when I graduated in 43, the last war we really fought was with the Seminoles in the swamps in Florida. And nothing the Army did fighting the Seminoles can be applied to the manuals of the armies in Europe that are fighting on these broad open fields with cannonades and sweeping cavalry charges. None of it applied. So those officers learned it as they went. And afterward, there was nothing they could do to expound on what we read and memorized to really help us. So it's up to us to kind of figure. And if you're not thinking about what doesn't work and adjusting, you're going to be caught. You know, the ones who, what the manual says, but yeah, well, they're reading the same manual, so we can't read that manual. Just two obvious points on that once you hear them. Telegraph is not discussed at West Point. All right, the first time telegraph is used is in 46 when we're sending men down to Corpus Christi to send them to Mexico. Railroads. First railroads in the country come in 1830s. The Army's not thinking about railroads at all. Railroads are used to move troops to Corpus Christi to go to Mexico, right? That's those civilian railroads. So there's no point of the Army having a railroad or appreciating the logistical importance of that. First time a railroad is used in military operation is 1859 when Marines are sent from Washington to go out to Harper's Ferry to bring John Brown in. And even then it's almost an afterthought because it's the quickest way to move them. And then somebody makes that connection and says, oh wait, the railroads might be important. Not a word of it taught at West Point. So things change by the end of the war. A lot changes that way. If we're going to have a professional standing Army with standards, a lot of what we're doing during the war is looked on then as a way to create those proper standards. Interesting thought on that.
What was the most effective weapon that he said?
The most effective weapon is the telegraph. Yeah, communication. I could have all the rapid fire weapons, I could have all the ammunition I need for artillery, and if I don't have a way to communicate how to use that, it's useless. Well, everything's coded, right? We don't send any messages out that are not ciphered. So that's another fun part of it, is everybody has to know what the cipher is. Because we get messages all the time that are just garbled, because the rebels don't know what they're doing if they're trying to tap in and do that. Because they do that quite a bit during the Vicksburg campaign, where we're getting all these other messages. So we know that's not ours. Right there, we can tell you. Yeah, even the messages about Lincoln, that's all ciphered before it gets to me. Yeah, you can't afford to let something like that be broadcast across telegraph lines. And it frustrated all the railroads we work with, because their telegraph man is right there. And my man's like, get out of the way, this is Army business, and push them out of the way to do things the way we need to have it done. So yeah, communication, most important. That's one of the reasons we send out so many couriers with the same message, to make sure it gets through. Yes, ma'am?
How did you feel about photography becoming a prominent
Photography?
feature in that war?
Oh, photography gets in my way all the time, because everybody wants pictures of me. There's a picture of me leaning on a tree at City Point, and the papers put that out and said that it shows my grim determination staring off to Richmond. That's the romanticized version of it. I'm staring like I am because I'm frustrated that I have to stand there posing for this man. Not just so much for that, because my vanity doesn't need stoking to have pictures taken of me, but in that moment posing, I had just received the casualty report at Cold Harbor where we lost 2,000 men in a 15-minute charge. And the first thing I do, okay, put your hand up this way, put your hand up here. And I'm trying to process what just happened to 2,000 men. And I have to stand here and have a picture. So, photographs can be a wonderful thing. They get in the way of what I'm trying to do in the field. We do learn mapping. You might be interested at West Point, we learn drawing. Why are we learning drawing?
Because you have Google Maps.
Right, topographical things. If I'm sent out to scout a location and I have to come back and describe it, I can draw the terrain, so I can draw the perspective and all. So we get a lot of that talk to us as well. Photography, the photos can be developed because the tintype is moving around the Ulysses before it develops, but even then, by the time you get it to somebody where it's useful, the situation could have changed. We're taking a picture of troops in the field, but they may not be there by the time we get in too. So telegraphs, most important. Photographs don't necessarily play into the military side of it. I know politicians love it. I think next to telegraph is the railroad. Railroad is the next most important thing. Yeah. So, please allow me to break character and thank you. I have a shameless fundraising thing I'm going through. There's a Civil War event in Huntington Beach every year over Labor Day weekend. And it started out of the veterans who moved there after the war. They started up this annual reunion thing, and it went out over World War II. And the town people there figured out in the late 80s that they should revive this. And so they created a Civil War event over the weekend of Labor Day. When I lived out there, I would do the event because I was there. I was their grant for a long time. And now they won't hire anybody to be grant if I don't make it. So they always invite me back. And for the last 3 or 4 years now, I have fundraised to support the trip because I have to take my canvas with me and I can't load that on an airplane and go out there. So I fundraised for a rental SUV, I load my canvas and my tent poles and all that, and I drive across. So I factored in how much the rental is and everything else to get me back and forth. And then they put me up out there and they feed me. There's VIP treatment for me when I'm there. But to get me there, it's a thing I do through. So I have flyers that will explain more of that. And I'll leave them up here for you. If you don't want to go through all of that, $10, $15, a couple heads do it. I have the whole month to do that, and I've got probably 15 more meetings with people to do. I'm going to be back in Jersey next week in Monroe Township in Monmouth County, talking about the Secret Lighthouse. So I'll be Abraham Wolf. I won't be General Grant for that. So I was asked by the Secret people a couple years ago. They saw me at the Jersey History Fair and they said, "Can you be our lighthouse keeper?" I said, "No." And they said, "Just the way you were so convincing, could you be Abraham Wolf?" I don't know anything about lighthouses. So they sent me this packet with all this information, and I was at their board meeting when I had the lighthouse board people there and talked about the lighthouse. So now it's just one of the programs I do. Kind of palate cleanser after doing all the grant stuff. But I'll be in Not from Pennsylvania. I can say Monongahela like nothing. Nataland, yeah, and I'll be in Burlington and Monroe Township and up in Caskin Ridge as well. So that's next week that I'll be out doing those things. If you want to hear the lighthouse program.
You should talk to me, because I'm in the party.
Right, well, I mentioned because Old Barney and the Naversings are on either side of Cedar, so I do mention that. I give me credit for that too, man. Yeah, the guy that I portrayed was a Civil War veteran. He was with an artillery unit that was out of Pittsburgh, that was at Peapatch Island in Delaware. And he used to pose as a Confederate prisoner when they brought new prisoners and get information out. And after the war, he lighthouse service right there, and he was at Osekan, and he was supposed to go to Barney, but because of his seniority in the program, they put him in Seager because it had the least amount of steps. Because he's old by that point too, so they gave it to him. Yeah. So lighthouse talk is fun. I know Jersey people love the lighthouse. So
Yes.
if you're interested in that.
Did you ever meet Jim Geddes?
Jim Getty?
Yeah.
Yeah. He lived across the street from me.
Really?
Yeah, I live in town.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. His last maybe 5-6 months he was ailing.
Yeah.
I'd go see him at least once a week. Because I walked in one time to see him, and his wife said, "Come back," because we said, "Hey, he's really tired. I'm sorry to interrupt." And she said, "No, he came to life, so you can come see him whenever you want." Because even in cities, I'd go see him. He's like, "General," you know. So he was a great man. Yeah, a lot of fun talking with him. We'd be in the post office together, and he's up at the counter, and the people in the post office would say, "Ladies and gentlemen, right here is President Lincoln," and I'd be stepping away from him, and he'd grab me like, "No, come over here," and go, "This is my general."
He was a wonderful leader.
Yeah. Oh, so much knowledge in him too, Joe. He's one of the inspirations, because him, and I had a really good Lincoln on the West Coast that I always played with out there. He passed not long after Getty passed.
Really?
And both of them told me the best way you'll be convincing is know the man's life, know his background, his friends, his family, and you'll be much more believable, you know, as that person. Because you can memorize dates and places all day, but if you don't know the family part of it.
I had a picture of my classroom of Getty
Yeah.
and me.
Yeah.
And I would always tell the kids, don't mess. I knew Lincoln.
You. I didn't use any of his pictures in the promos. I tried to use Lincoln's that had pictures kind of like the back or the side, because they're all different. So I didn't want somebody to go, "That's not Lincoln," because that one's over there. So I think I've worked with 13 different Lincolns. 5 different Robert E. Lees, and a couple others. Yeah. The Lincoln that's in California now, he's on commercials now, so we call him Hollywood Bob. Bob Brewski is his name. Yeah, he's in all these different commercials. Oh yeah, nice. Yeah, I went to see him do the address one year in Gettysburg, and he was up on that big brick thing in the cemetery and all. And I went in uniform just because. And he got done talking to everybody, and we're all starting to walk away, and he called out, "General Grant." Okay, so I didn't want to upstage or anything. He goes, "No, come over here, walk with me." So he wanted me to hang with him all through that. This is great. Put his arm around, you know. So it was neat to have this. I met him in the same spot.
That's great.
That's the best place. Yeah, great man. Yeah, sorry, sad to see him go.
Yeah.
Well, Liz.
Thank you so much, Ken, for coming. Thank you all for coming today. We have leftover bagels. Thanks up here. Boiling?
Yeah.
We're looking to replace the whole thing.
Thank you. I'm on that.
No. Yeah, everything was fluid, they sorted out. Yeah.